Night falls like a heavy curtain, and the world surrenders to shadows. Somewhere in the stillness, a whisper stirs. It isn't the wind, nor the creak of an old wooden beam. It's something older, something forbidden. The air thickens, pressing down like unseen hands. A woman dreams, but it isn't a peaceful slumber. Her body is still, yet her spirit flails in the grip of something dark. She cannot move. She cannot scream. It starts with a breath, soft, warm, and intimate, brushing against her neck. Her pulse quickens, though her eyes remain shut. She feels it now, a presence, looming over her, both alluring and terrifying. Her skin prickles. The sensation crawls through her veins, setting her nerves on fire. Her chest rises and falls in shallow gasps as invisible lips trace her flesh. But this is no lover. The weight on her chest grows heavier, as though an unseen force has pinned her down. Fear claws at her throat, but her body won't obey. She wants to wake up, to break free, yet the force refuses to release her. Her thoughts spin, and somewhere deep in her mind, she knows she's not alone. She is being watched, tasted, claimed. When the dawn breaks, she sits upright, drenched in sweat. Her heart slams against her ribcage, but the room is empty. She touches her skin, trembling. No marks, no bruises. Yet the memory lingers, the touch, the weight, the desire that wasn't her own. She shivers. She isn't sure if she's grateful or disappointed. And somewhere, far beyond her understanding, something smiles. Centuries ago, whispers like these traveled from trembling lips to the ears of priests and scribes. They spoke of spirits who slipped into the shadows of night, feeding on dreams and desires. They called them demons. They called them cursed. But most of all, they called them real. Long before the word succubus took form, there were stories of women who walked unseen, yet carried hunger in their eyes. The oldest record spoke of Lilith, a winged creature feared in ancient Mesopotamia. Men whispered of her beauty, terrible and perfect, as she roamed the desert winds, seducing wanderers in their sleep. Those who awoke after her visit felt hollowed out, like something precious had been stolen. The stories bled across lands, each one darker than the last. Lilith's name twisted and grew, until it became Lilith, a being feared not just for her hunger but for her defiance. They said she was Adam's first wife, the one who refused to bow, the one who abandoned Eden rather than surrender. Her punishment was exile, her revenge was eternal. Some say she drank the lifeblood of men, leaving them pale and broken. Others say she cradled infants in the night and stole their breath. But all agreed on one thing: her touch could make you beg for more even as it destroyed you. Her legend took root and sprouted new branches, winding through time like a creeping vine. In medieval Europe, she wore new faces, adopting names and shapes that suited the fears of the age. They saw her in the flicker of candlelight, in the restless dreams of monks, in the shadows of women who dared to claim their own power. Succubi were no longer just demons. They became symbols, warnings wrapped in flesh and sin. They reminded men of temptation and weakness, of the forbidden desires that slithered beneath polished prayers. Each story painted them more vividly: silken hair, lips stained red, voices dripping with honeyed poison. They were dangerous, but irresistible. And so the world watched and feared, but it also wondered. Could such creatures truly exist? Were they merely shadows cast by guilty minds, or was there something real beneath the tales? The uncertainty only fed the fire, and the myths refused to die. Over time, their hunger began to shape them. No longer mere whispers in the night, they became queens of seduction, wielding power through longing and fear. Their eyes promised pleasure, but their hands held chains. They didn't need claws or fangs to destroy. A glance was enough. Even now, stories persist. People wake in the dead of night, drenched in sweat, clutching sheets that feel too heavy. They speak of voices in the dark and unseen caresses that leave them breathless. Science may explain it as dreams, but the fear remains. The succubi endure, not just as shadows in ancient texts, but as echoes in the corners of our minds. And as long as there are desires left unspoken and fears buried deep, their legend will continue to grow. The desert winds carried more than sand, they carried whispers. Whispers of a woman with wings like shadows and eyes that saw through flesh and bone. She moved unseen, gliding between the worlds of man and spirit, her name spoken only in hushed tones. Lilith, the night hunter, the stormbringer, the first taste of the forbidden. In ancient Mesopotamia, people feared the night. It wasn't the darkness that frightened them, but what waited within it. The night was alive, and so were its shadows. They believed spirits roamed freely, slipping through cracks in the earth and sliding into homes while their occupants slept. But none were feared more than the beings who fed on breath, blood, and desire. Lilith was not born. She was shaped by fear, molded from hunger, and given wings to haunt the dreams of men. She was no gentle spirit. She was a storm, howling, untamed, and hungry. Her beauty was said to be blinding, her presence unbearable. She didn't whisper sweet nothings, she demanded surrender. Her story began with the wind. It was said she flew across deserts and wastelands, her cries echoing like the wails of abandoned children. She didn't linger in one place, she hunted where hearts were weakest. Her victims woke with hollow eyes and trembling limbs, drained of strength but aching for more. The priests warned against her. They hung amulets carved with names of gods to keep her away. They burned incense and salt, hoping the smoke would block her path. But the women feared her the most. Lilith wasn't content with men, she envied mothers. She despised their warmth, their ability to create life. And so, the legend said, she crept into nurseries, stealing infants before their first cries could reach the heavens. But Lilith was more than a thief. She was temptation made flesh. The tablets carved in cuneiform told of men who begged the gods for her touch, despite the ruin she left behind. Her name was etched into spells and curses, warnings written in trembling hands. To see her was to know both fear and desire, and there was no escape from either. She was not alone. Lilith's sisters, spirits like her, moved through the night as well. Some called them the ardent lily, maidens of the wind. They sang through the darkness, drawing men from their beds and pulling them into madness. They promised ecstasy and left only emptiness. These tales weren't just cautionary. They carried weight, woven into the rituals of daily life. Childbirth was guarded with chants and prayers, for fear that Lilith's claws would tear the life from the newborn. Brides wore charms to protect their marriage beds from her jealous wrath. Even the walls of temples bore symbols to keep her out, as though stone alone could bar the desires she stirred. Lilith wasn't just a monster, she was a force. Her hunger mirrored the cravings hidden within every heart, the things people feared to admit but could not resist. She embodied lust, loneliness, and longing, wearing them like armor. She didn't need chains to bind her victims. She used their own desires to trap them. As time passed, Lilith's legend stretched and twisted. She became Lilith in later traditions, her story tangled with rebellion and ruin. But Mesopotamia remembered her first, the winged predator whose hunger could never be satisfied. And perhaps that's why the fear lingered. Because Lilith wasn't a creature bound to the past. Her name may have faded, but her shadow never left. It waits, hidden in the corners of dreams, where reason falters and desires rise. Where something ancient still watches. Still waits. And when the wind howls, some say it's her voice, calling for those who dare to listen. Or those too weak to resist. The night carried a different weight when her name was spoken. Lilith. It wasn't a name meant for comfort. It tasted sharp, like a blade hidden in silk. Her story wasn't told to soothe children. It was whispered in fear, carved into ancient amulets, and scratched into doorways. She wasn't just a shadow in the dark, she was the dark. And her hunger had no end. In the Jewish tradition, Lilith wasn't born in fire or storm. She was shaped from the same earth as Adam, equal, unyielding, and unwilling to kneel. But equality was never what the world wanted from her. She refused to bow, refused to break, and so she was cast out. Exiled. forgotten by heaven, embraced by the night. The Zohar spoke of her with both reverence and dread. It called her the first woman, but also the first demon. She was more than flesh, she was spirit. The embodiment of defiance. They said she flew from Eden and sought refuge among the wild things, where no man's word could bind her. But freedom came with a cost, and the heavens cursed her womb. Unable to create life, she took it instead. She prowled the edges of the world, her beauty a trap, her touch a death sentence. The texts described her as a seductress draped in crimson, her hair flowing like rivers of blood. She wasn't soft or gentle. She was hunger incarnate, feeding on passion and fear in equal measure. For the pious, Lilith was a warning. She embodied everything forbidden, lust, rebellion, and desires that burned too bright. But beneath the fear, there was something more dangerous. Curiosity. Some didn't see a monster when they looked at her, they saw freedom. Lilith didn't beg for love. She took it. She didn't wait for permission. She demanded surrender. Her power wasn't in brute strength, but in her ability to unearth hidden wants, to strip away shame until there was nothing left but need. The Zohar didn't shy away from her darkness. It described her as the mother of demons, a queen who ruled over spirits that fed on weakness. She was said to haunt lonely men, visiting them in dreams, twisting their desires into chains. And when the sun rose, they woke hollowed out, their souls frayed at the edges. But Lilith wasn't satisfied with dreams. She wanted flesh. She seduced husbands, drained their vitality, and left them yearning for more even as their strength faded. The Zohar warned that she craved children too, not to nurture but to devour. She slipped into nurseries, stealing breaths from newborns and leaving grief in her wake. Fear of her touch ran so deep that mothers hung protective charms, written prayers and symbols, above their babies' cribs. The words were meant to bind her, to keep her hunger at bay. But even then, the fear never fully disappeared. Some scholars whispered that Lilith wasn't just a demon. She was something older, something that had always existed in the cracks between light and shadow. She didn't need temples or prayers. She fed on longing, on loneliness, on the secrets people refused to speak aloud. And yet, there were others who saw her differently. They didn't fear her. They admired her. To them, Lilith wasn't a monster but a symbol, a woman who refused to be chained. A woman who embraced her desires instead of burying them. A woman who chose exile over obedience. But that admiration came with danger. Those who sought her out rarely returned the same. Her allure wasn't gentle, it was overwhelming. The text spoke of men who chased her into the wilderness, desperate for her touch. They gave up everything, families, homes, sanity, just for a glimpse of the forbidden. And she welcomed them. She held them close, whispered promises in their ears, and drained them until there was nothing left but shadows. The Zohar didn't leave room for doubt. Lilith wasn't a fairy tale. She was real, and her hunger had no limits. She moved through the night, unseen but felt, leaving traces of her touch in the restless dreams of men and the midnight cries of children. Even now, some say her name is best left unspoken. Because to call her is to invite her. And once she arrives, she doesn't leave. Not empty-handed. The candlelight flickered, casting restless shadows across the stone walls. A monk knelt in prayer, his lips moving silently, his hands trembling. He had fasted for days, begging God to shield him from the temptations that gnawed at his soul. But the night had other plans. Sleep came slowly, and with it, the scent of something sweet, too sweet. Roses and honey. The kind of scent that didn't belong in a monastery. He opened his eyes, but the room was empty. The shadows stretched and twisted, and then she appeared. She wasn't clothed in rags or sin. She wore beauty like a weapon, her hair spilling down her shoulders, her skin glowing as though it had never known the touch of the sun. Her lips curved, but her eyes burned. He tried to look away, to pray, but the words stuck in his throat. This was no dream. This was temptation given form. Early Christianity spoke of demons that preyed upon men's weaknesses, but none stirred as much fear as the succubus. She was sin made flesh, the enemy of virtue, a creature born not to devour the body but to corrupt the soul. She did not come with horns or claws. She came with softness, with whispers, with a gaze that turned prayers to ash. Her beauty was blasphemous, a mockery of what was pure. The church fathers wrote of her with trembling hands, warning that she could slip through locked doors and holy walls, carried by desire and doubt. The monks believed she was sent by Satan himself, a temptress with the power to unravel a man's faith. She didn't force herself upon her victims. She didn't need to. She offered pleasure, and the shame came later. The writings of St. Augustine and St. Jerome hinted at her presence, describing spirits that visited men in their sleep, leaving them drenched in sweat and guilt. They said she fed not just on flesh, but on the soul itself, draining her victims until their prayers fell silent. Theologians argued about her origin. Was she a fallen angel, cast out with Lucifer, or was she born from the sins of man? Some believed she was Lilith, reshaped and reborn, still bitter, still hungry. Others thought she was Eve's shadow, the part of woman that craved power and passion instead of obedience. The church feared her not just because she seduced men, but because she made them want to be seduced. She turned desire into a prison and guilt into chains. She proved that even the holiest could fall. Confessions poured in. Monks admitted to waking in the dead of night, haunted by dreams too vivid to be dismissed. Some claimed to see her eyes in the darkness, watching, waiting. Others fell into despair, convinced they had already lost their souls. Exorcisms were performed, prayers recited. But the fear remained. The succubus didn't need to be seen to be felt. Her presence lingered, hidden in every stolen glance, every forbidden thought. In the eyes of the early church, she was more than a demon. She was a test, a trap set for those who dared to think they were above temptation. She didn't break her victims. She let them break themselves. And when they did, she was there to watch. The monks carved symbols into their doors, hung crucifixes above their beds, and prayed for protection. But even then, they knew the truth. She wasn't bound by walls or words. She could slip between the cracks in their faith, feeding on the doubt that no prayer could erase. And when the candles burned out, and the silence returned, they knew she was still there. Waiting. The fires burned low, casting trembling light across the cold stone floor. A woman knelt before the priest, her hands clutching at the coarse fabric of her dress. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and tears streaked her dirt-smeared face. The priest's shadow loomed over her as he raised the holy text, his voice trembling with something that wasn't entirely fear. "What sin have you invited into your soul?" Her lips parted, but no words came. She couldn't describe what had happened. The heat of invisible hands, the whispers that slid through her mind like silk. She couldn't explain the dreams that left her aching and ashamed. Her voice cracked as she confessed, but even as she spoke, the memory of the touch still lingered. It hadn't felt like damnation. It had felt like longing. The priest's gaze hardened. He had heard these stories before, too many times. This was no ordinary sin. This was the work of demons. The medieval world was steeped in fear of the unseen. Everything unknown, everything forbidden, was whispered to be the work of the devil. And nothing stirred more fear or fascination than desire. Desire wasn't just a temptation, it was a weapon. It could unmake vows, unravel faith, and stain even the purest soul. And when desire came without a face, without a name, it was the succubus that took the blame. She was the enemy of piety, a creature who crept into the beds of holy men and righteous women alike. She slipped past prayers and walls, her voice as sweet as honey and her touch as deadly as poison. In the darkest hours, when faith wavered and flesh grew weak, she arrived. The church gave her many names. She was the handmaiden of Satan, the queen of lust, the corrupter of men's dreams. She was painted in crimson robes with bare shoulders and burning eyes, her beauty an insult to purity. She didn't need chains to bind her victims, only whispers. Desire was not to be trusted. It was fire, and fire belonged to hell. The succubus became the face of that fire, a walking sin that proved even the strongest could fall. Men prayed to be spared from her visits, but their prayers carried guilt. They knew why she came. She wasn't summoned by spells or incantations, she was summoned by hunger, the kind that festered in locked rooms and lonely nights. She was temptation personified, and resisting her only made her stronger. Confessions filled the churches. Women spoke of dreams that left them trembling. Men fell to their knees, begging forgiveness for thoughts they couldn't silence. The fear of her was so great that priests wrote entire manuals on how to ward her off. Salt was scattered by bedsides. Crucifixes were placed above doors. Prayers were whispered until throats grew raw. But the fear wasn't just for the flesh. It was for the soul. The succubus didn't just tempt, she devoured. Her lovers woke pale and hollow-eyed, drained of life, but burning for more. And when she was done, the priest said, she carried their souls with her, dragging them down to hell. For women, the fear ran deeper. To feel desire, to admit to pleasure, was to risk being branded as one of them. The line between victim and monster blurred. A woman accused of stirring lust could be cast out, tried, even burned. It didn't matter if her sins were imagined. The fire didn't care. The church's warnings were clear. The succubus was not just a demon, she was a mirror. She reflected what people wanted and what they feared wanting. She was the voice that whispered that desire wasn't sin, but freedom. And that was the most dangerous lie of all. The fires in the churches burned brighter, but they couldn't chase away the shadows. Fear lingered. The idea that someone, something, could crawl into a man's soul and leave him empty haunted the faithful. And late at night, when the prayers had faded and the candles had melted down to nothing, the silence left room for the whispers to return. Whispers that carried the scent of roses and honey. Whispers that promised pleasure and ruin. The night was heavy, the air thick with the weight of unspoken fears. A man lay trembling in his bed, his heart pounding as a shadow moved in the corner of the room. He couldn't see her, but he felt her. She didn't need chains to hold him. The fear did that well enough. Elsewhere, a woman knelt on the cold earth, her wrists bound, her face streaked with tears as the crowd shouted for fire. They didn't see her as flesh and blood. They saw her as a vessel for evil, a temptress born to destroy. Her cries were swallowed by the crackling of flames as the smoke carried their judgment to the heavens. In the eyes of the medieval world, demons weren't just creatures of horror. They were mirrors, reflecting the deepest fears and desires of the people who believed in them. And no fear cut deeper than the fear of gender, what it could represent, what it could corrupt, and what it could control. The succubus stood at the center of that fear. She was temptation with a woman's face and a serpent's tongue. She fed on lust, but she also fed on guilt. Her existence told men that desire was dangerous, that it could unman them, strip them of power, and leave them hollowed out. But she was more than a predator. She was a punishment. Her beauty was her weapon, but her sin was her defiance. She didn't submit. She didn't beg. She didn't shrink under holy words or sacred symbols. She demanded, seduced, and took what she wanted. In doing so, she shattered the fragile image of obedience that men clung to. The succubus wasn't feared just for what she did, but for what she represented, a woman untamed, unashamed, and unrepentant. She blurred the line between victim and predator, turning desire into destruction. And for that, she had to be condemned. But she wasn't the only one. Men had their demons too. The incubus haunted women, slipping into their dreams and leaving them breathless and broken. But he wasn't feared the same way. He wasn't painted as a monster wearing beauty like a mask. Instead, he was a shadow, an intruder, a thief in the night. He took what he wanted and vanished, leaving shame and whispers in his wake. Women who fell to the incubus weren't accused of weakness or sin. They were victims, their bodies violated, their spirits shattered. Men who fell to the succubus, however, were complicit. Their desires made them guilty, and their guilt made them damned. The difference wasn't subtle. It was a wound that split the world in two, one law for men, another for women. Men were warned to guard their thoughts, to resist temptation, but they were still seen as human. Women were told to guard their very existence, to be pure, to be silent, to be small. And if they failed, they weren't victims. They were witches. The succubus became more than a demon. She became a weapon used to control women, to shame desire, to twist pleasure into something forbidden. A woman who dared to embrace her body, who stepped outside the lines of obedience, risked being labeled as one of them. Her beauty became her crime. Her confidence became her curse. Her independence became her proof of guilt. But fear has a way of turning into fascination. The same men who trembled in their beds and carved crosses into their doors couldn't look away. The same priests who warned against her touch described her in words that dripped with longing. She was a nightmare, yes, but she was also a fantasy. And that was the true danger. The succubus didn't just haunt their dreams. She haunted their thoughts. She reminded them that the line between sin and desire was paper-thin, that fear and hunger were bound together. And in the end, she didn't need to take their souls. They offered them willingly. But the fires didn't stop. The accusations didn't fade. Women continued to burn for sins they hadn't committed, while men whispered about demons with lips like wine and eyes that promised everything they shouldn't want. And as the smoke rose, the question lingered. Who was the real monster, the succubus, or the world that created her? The candle light flickered as the scholar leaned closer to his manuscript, the ink still wet on the parchment. He had spent countless nights poring over texts that spoke of angels and demons, of sin and salvation, but this was different. The words on the page didn't tremble with warnings of damnation. They pulsed with fascination. The Renaissance was a time of rebirth, but not just for art and science. It was a rebirth of shadows too, of forbidden desires and ancient fears wrapped in silk and whispered through the corridors of candlelit libraries. The succubus was no longer just a nightmare clawing at the edges of sleep. She became something far more dangerous. She became an obsession. In the quiet corners of Renaissance Europe, as the church's grip wrestled with the growing whispers of reason and curiosity, the image of the succubus began to change. She wasn't merely a monster to be feared, she became a muse. Painters gave her form, lush curves draped in crimson and black, her eyes burning with secrets too dangerous to name. Poets wrote of her lips, her laughter, her power to shatter a man's soul with nothing but a glance. The old stories lingered, of course. She was still a thief of life, still the shadow that turned holy men into sinners. But now, those same men began to ask questions they never dared before. Was she a demon, or was she something more? Desire was no longer just sin, it was art. Passion was no longer just a curse, it was inspiration. And the succubus, born of fire and forbidden longing, stepped out of the shadows and into the light, her beauty no longer hidden, her power no longer denied. For some, this new fascination was intoxicating. Artists sculpted her into statues of marble and bronze, their hands lingering on the curves of her hips as if they, too, had fallen under her spell. Writers described her with trembling pens, their words betraying the hunger they couldn't contain. Even scholars, those guardians of reason, began to question whether the succubus was just an allegory, a warning against the dangers of lust, or something real, something that walked among them, unseen but always felt. But for others, her evolution brought terror. The Renaissance wasn't just an age of beauty, it was an age of fire. Witch trials spread like storms, sweeping through villages and cities, leaving smoke and ash in their wake. Women accused of seduction, of witchcraft, of tempting men into sin, were stripped, tortured, and burned. The lines between human and demon blurred. A woman who knew the power of her own beauty, who dared to wield it instead of hiding it, risked being branded as one of them. She didn't need horns or wings, her defiance was proof enough. And so the succubus became both fantasy and fear, worshipped in secret and condemned in public. She haunted paintings and sculptures, her beauty carved into stone and stretched across canvas, but she also haunted the screams of those dragged to the stake, their cries echoing against the walls of cathedrals. The church fought to keep her chained in sermons and scripture, but the artists and poets set her free. She danced in their verses, smiled from their paintings, and whispered through their stories. Her hunger became their inspiration. Her defiance became their rebellion. But even as they painted her in gold and crimson, they couldn't forget what she was. Beneath the beauty, there was still danger. Beneath the longing, there was still fear. And as the Renaissance bled into the centuries that followed, the succubus refused to fade. Her story twisted and turned, shifting with the times, but one thing remained. Whether feared or desired, condemned or worshipped, she never stopped haunting those who dared to look too long. And as the candles burned down and the ink dried on the scholars' pages, the whispers continued. Whispers of shadows that moved in the night, of lips that stole breath, and of eyes that promised both pleasure and ruin. The moon hung low over the forest, its pale light spilling through the trees like silver mist. Somewhere in the shadows, laughter echoed, soft, musical, and just out of reach. A traveler stopped, his heart pounding. He wasn't alone. He could feel her eyes, sharp as daggers, watching from the darkness. Stories of fox spirits had a way of making the air colder. They spoke of beauty that bewitched and smiles that hid fangs. In the east, where mountains touched the heavens and rivers whispered secrets, the fox spirit was more than a myth. She was a warning, a temptation, and a nightmare wrapped in silk. In China, they called her the Huli Jing, the fox that walked between worlds. She could be a blessing or a curse, a wife or a monster. Her beauty was her greatest weapon, and her hunger was endless. Men fell at her feet, blinded by the illusion of love, only to wake in the morning as hollow shells, drained of life, their souls stolen while they slept. But not all fox spirits hunted. Some fell in love, bound themselves to humans, and became wives and mothers. Yet even in those stories, there was unease. Could a fox ever be trusted? Could love tame something born from shadows? The answers hung in the air like unfinished prayers. In Japan, the kitsune was even more cunning. She slipped into the lives of men, wearing the face of a lost lover or a lonely stranger. She could shapeshift, her body bending like water, her voice soft enough to drown out doubt. But her tales, those 9 flowing tales that marked her power, always gave her away. Legend said the kitsune fed on the energy of men, not just their bodies but their spirits, their dreams. She didn't take by force. She seduced, pulling them closer with whispers and smiles until they gave themselves willingly. And once they did, there was no going back. But the kitsune wasn't always cruel. She could be fiercely loyal, protecting those she loved with teeth and claws. Some stories painted her as a trickster, others as a goddess. She was never just one thing, never just good or evil. She was desire and danger, wrapped in fur and fire. Yet the fear never faded. In Korea, the gumiho took the form of a beautiful woman with a heart as cold as stone. She didn't need spells or illusions. Her beauty was enough to lure men into her arms. But once they kissed her lips, they were lost. She tore out their hearts, devoured their livers, and left their bodies crumpled in the dirt. The gumiho wasn't just a predator. She was a tragedy. In some tales, she longed to be human, to shed her hunger and live among mortals. But her curse ran too deep. No matter how much she tried to love, she always hungered for more, for flesh, for life, for the one thing she could never have. The fox spirits of Asia weren't just monsters. They were symbols, reflections of fear and fascination tangled together. Men feared their beauty because it made them weak. They feared their cunning because it made them powerless. And they feared their hunger because it was their own. But the fox spirits weren't just reflections of men's desires. They were warnings to women, too. A woman who wielded her beauty like a weapon risked being called one of them, dangerous, untrustworthy, unnatural. A woman who refused to submit, who dared to want more, walked the edge of the same blade. In the stillness of night, when footsteps echoed and shadows danced, the line between human and spirit blurred. The fox spirits reminded people that beauty could be a trap, that desire could be deadly, and that some hungers could never be satisfied. The traveler in the forest never saw her coming. Her laughter wrapped around him, pulling him closer, drowning out the voice that whispered for him to run. And as the moon slipped behind the clouds, the shadows swallowed them both. The drums echoed through the night, their rhythm ancient and unrelenting. Beneath the vast African sky, shadows stretched long and dark, dancing with the flicker of firelight. The villagers gathered close, their voices hushed as the storyteller began. Tonight, they would speak of spirits, beautiful, dangerous, and hungry. Spirits that wore human skin but had no human soul. In many African traditions, seductive spirits were not just whispers in the dark, they were warnings carved into memory. Tales of beings like the Mami Wata flowed through rivers and streams, their beauty as mesmerizing as the water they called home. She emerged from the depths, her skin glistening like polished obsidian, her eyes like pools of night. No man could resist her gaze. No heart could escape her call. Mami Wata was more than a name. She was a force. She promised riches and pleasure, but her gifts came with chains. Those who swore loyalty to her gained wealth beyond imagination, yet they lost pieces of themselves, slipping deeper into her world until they no longer recognized their reflection. Men followed her into the waters, enchanted by her beauty, only to vanish without a trace. But not all who loved her perished. Some lived, bound to her forever, their lives filled with visions and dreams they could never explain. They worshipped her, offering gifts and prayers, hoping to satisfy her hunger before it devoured them. And yet, Mami Wata was not always cruel. To women, she was a protector, a symbol of power and independence. She punished betrayal, but she rewarded loyalty. Those who honored her could rise above their suffering, commanding respect and fear. In West Africa, another spirit whispered through the forests, the Abiku. She was a child born of shadows, her laughter carrying both innocence and malice. Abiku spirits often returned again and again, born into human families only to die young and slip back into the spirit world. But some legends spoke of Abiku who grew into adulthood, their hunger twisting into something darker. They appeared in dreams, their faces too perfect, their touch too soft. Men who followed them woke with empty hearts, their strength stolen, their spirits hollow. The Abiku didn't need to chase. Their victims came willingly, lured by smiles that promised love but brought ruin. In the deserts, the Karina was said to walk unseen, her feet leaving no trace in the sand. She waited for lonely travelers, appearing as a mirage, an oasis of beauty and comfort. But the closer one came, the deeper they fell under her spell. The Karina didn't kill quickly. She fed slowly, draining hope, will, and life until nothing remained but a husk. But perhaps the most haunting stories came from the forests, where the Iwan, spirits of desire and despair, danced beneath the trees. They were shapeshifters, able to become anyone, anything. They appeared as lost lovers, forgotten friends, or strangers who felt too familiar. Their words were honey, their touch fire. And once they touched your soul, they never let go. Men disappeared chasing these spirits, their bodies found days later, eyes wide with terror, lips curved in smiles they never chose. Women, too, fell victim, not always to the Iwan themselves, but to the men who returned haunted, broken, unable to tell the difference between dream and reality. But the stories didn't just warn of spirits. They warned of hunger, the kind that grows in silence, that twists love into possession and beauty into a curse. The spirits weren't always the ones to fear. Sometimes, it was the ones who followed them, desperate to taste what could never be theirs. The drums faded, and the storyteller's voice softened. In the crowd, some eyes burned with fear, others with longing. For even as the warnings rang out, the beauty of the spirits lingered. Their laughter still echoed in the night, and somewhere in the shadows, they waited for the weak, the lonely, and the curious. And as the fire dimmed and the darkness crept closer, the villagers whispered prayers, not for protection, but for the strength to resist the call. Because the spirits didn't need chains to trap their prey. All they needed was a glance, a smile, and the promise of something too sweet to refuse. The jungle hummed with life, its breath thick and sweet. Moonlight filtered through the tangled canopy, silvering the leaves and turning shadows into living things. Somewhere deep within that endless green, a man staggered forward, his chest heaving, his eyes wild with terror and desire. She was close. He could feel her. The woman with skin like golden sunlight and eyes that burned like embers. The woman who wasn't a woman at all. In the myths of South America, the forests whispered of her, the encantado, the shape-shifting seductress who emerged from rivers cloaked in beauty and mystery. She wasn't just a creature, she was a warning. They said she came from beneath the waters, where ancient cities gleamed and spirits sang. She took the shape of a human, but her essence was far older, far darker. Fishermen told stories of hearing her voice drifting over the water, soft as a lover's sigh, pulling them closer until the river swallowed them whole. Travelers swore they saw her dancing by the shore, her movements hypnotic, her laughter weaving spells that tangled minds and hearts. But by the time they realized what she was, it was too late. The encantado wasn't bound to the water. She could walk among mortals, slip into their lives like a shadow, leaving chaos and longing in her wake. Her victims often returned days later, broken and dazed, unable to explain what had happened. Some never returned at all, their bodies claimed by the rivers, their souls bound to her forever. But she wasn't alone in the dark. In the highlands and valleys, another legend took shape, the La Tunda, a creature born of hunger and malice. She lured men and children into the wilderness, appearing as someone they trusted, a mother, a lover, a friend. Her disguise was flawless, but there was always something wrong, something too perfect, too smooth. It was said that La Tunda fed slowly, keeping her victims alive as she drained them bit by bit. She used spells and whispers, weaving illusions so strong that her prey begged to stay, even as they wasted away. Her victims didn't die screaming, they died smiling, lost in dreams that felt more real than the world they'd left behind. Further south, the Pishtaco prowled the mountains. Though often seen as a male predator, some stories spoke of female Pishtacos, beautiful and deadly, drawing men in only to bleed them dry. These beings weren't just thieves of blood, they were thieves of life itself, stealing vitality, warmth, and willpower. But perhaps the most feared seductress of all was the Yara, the Lady of the Waters. She ruled over lakes and rivers, her beauty unmatched, her voice like the wind through the reeds. Yara didn't need to chase her prey. They came willingly, entranced by her songs and the promise of something too sweet to resist. Men who saw her face never looked away. They followed her into the depths, leaving behind their homes, their families, their very lives. Those who resisted her call often found themselves haunted by visions, dreams where her face lingered, her voice echoed, and her touch burned. But the Yara wasn't just a predator. Some said she was a goddess, betrayed by love and cursed to wander the waters forever. Others believed she was a guardian, punishing those who dared to desecrate the rivers and forests. Her story blurred the line between victim and monster, making her both feared and worshipped. Even as the myths warned of danger, there was something irresistible about these spirits. They embodied forbidden desires, primal fears, and the hunger for something beyond the ordinary. They weren't just monsters, they were mirrors, reflecting the darkness people tried to bury. The jungle listened. Its leaves rustled, its rivers whispered, and its shadows moved. Somewhere in the night, a woman's laughter floated through the air, soft and sweet and deadly. The man in the forest stopped running. He turned, his breath hitching, his heart pounding. And then he stepped forward, toward the voice that promised everything he'd ever wanted. The desert wind carried secrets. It whistled through the dunes, stirring grains of sand that had buried countless stories, tales of love, betrayal, and shadows that wore the faces of beauty. Beneath the pale glow of the moon, travelers gathered by the fire, their eyes darting toward the horizon, wary of what lurked beyond the safety of the light. For in the silence of the Arabian night, the Qareen waited. In Arabic folklore, the Qareen was not just a whisper in the dark. She was a companion bound to every soul, unseen but ever present, her voice as soft as silk and sharp as a blade. While some believed the Quran mirrored their thoughts and desires, others spoke of her darker nature, seductive, dangerous, and impossible to resist. She didn't merely tempt, she unraveled. Men wandering the deserts often told stories of women appearing in the heat of the day, shimmering like mirages. Their beauty was otherworldly, their eyes like pools of midnight. But when these men reached out to touch what they saw, the illusion shifted. The women faded, leaving only laughter and emptiness behind, or worse, an obsession that gnawed at the soul until madness took hold. The Alduais, another spirit spoken of in hushed tones, was a predator cloaked in elegance. Her beauty drew men like moths to a flame, her perfume lingering in the air long after she vanished. She promised passion and escape, but her embrace was a trap. Those who fell under her spell never returned whole. Some disappeared entirely, their names fading from memory, as if they had never existed. But the Alduais was more than a seductress. Her story twisted with layers of vengeance and sorrow. She was said to be a woman betrayed in life, her love turned to rage and her soul cursed to wander the earth. Some believed she preyed only on unfaithful men, punishing them for sins that echoed her own heartbreak. Others warned that she cared nothing for justice, only hunger. There were whispers, too, of the Gula, a creature that roamed the wastelands. Unlike the soft allure of the Quran or Alduais, the Gula was raw hunger wrapped in deceit. She took the form of a beautiful woman to lure travelers closer, her voice sweet, her touch warm. But the moment her victim's guard fell, she revealed her true face, a thing of fangs and shadows. It was said the Gula didn't just feed on flesh. She drank dreams and devoured hope, leaving nothing but hollow shells behind. And yet, men still chased after her, blinded by the illusion of what they thought she was. In the markets of old Arabia, storytellers painted pictures of the jinn, beings of smokeless fire who could take any form they pleased. Some jinn were said to appear as beautiful women, their voices laced with magic. They whispered promises of riches and love, but their gifts came with a price. The jinn's touch left marks, scars invisible to the eye but heavy on the soul. Many believed the jinn didn't seduce out of malice, but out of loneliness, yearning for connection with mortals who could never fully understand them. Others feared the jinn for what they represented, a force that defied control, boundless and untamed. But perhaps the most unsettling tales were those of Layla al Ghul, a spirit whose name meant night. She was said to haunt the dreams of men, appearing as the perfect lover, gentle, devoted, and endlessly beautiful. Her victims awoke in sweat, craving the touch of a woman who existed only in their minds. And yet, she left them marked, her presence lingering like a shadow that stretched longer each night. No one knew what Layla truly wanted. Some believed she stole pieces of her victims' souls, feeding on their longing. Others whispered that she was searching for something she had lost, a lover, a child, or perhaps even her own humanity. The desert stretched endlessly, its dunes shifting like memories. The men by the fire listened, their faces flickering with unease. They knew the stories weren't just warnings. They were truths disguised as legends, fragments of encounters no one dared to speak of openly. The wind carried a laugh, not loud, but soft, like silk brushing against skin. One of the men stood, his eyes fixed on the shadows beyond the fire's glow. His breath quickened. He could feel her. She was waiting. And no matter how much he told himself it was only a story, he took a step toward the darkness, drawn by a force older than reason. The night pressed against the walls like a living thing, thick and suffocating. The fire in the hearth had died, leaving only faint embers glowing like dying stars. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, but inside the cabin, all was still, except for the weight. It crushed down on his chest, cold fingers pressing against his ribs. He couldn't move. He couldn't scream. She was there. In the dim light, he saw her, hunched at the edge of his bed, her hollow eyes locked onto his. Her hair hung like tangled roots, and her lips curled into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her presence seeped into the room, heavy and thick, the air sharp with the scent of damp earth. He tried to breathe, But the pressure grew stronger. The night hag had come. In the frozen landscapes of northern Europe, she was whispered about in hushed tones, the mare, the bringer of nightmares. Her name echoed through the forests and over the fjords, leaving a trail of fear that stretched across generations. She wasn't bound to the world of the living, yet she moved through it with purpose, drawn to the vulnerable, the lonely, and the restless. The mare didn't need to lure her victims with beauty. She came in the dark, slipping into dreams like a shadow, her presence felt but unseen. Some said she rode her victims as they slept, pressing down on their chests until their hearts pounded and their breaths grew shallow. Others claimed she fed on fear itself, weaving nightmares so vivid that her prey woke drenched in sweat, their minds tangled in terror. But there were darker whispers, stories that spoke of the mare's hunger for more than fear. She didn't just watch, she entered her victims, leaving them hollow and trembling. Men who encountered her awoke changed, haunted by visions, tormented by desires they couldn't name. She was a shadow they couldn't shake, her touch lingering long after the night had passed. Some believed the mare was a cursed soul, a woman who had died with hatred in her heart. Others said she was born from witchcraft, her spirit twisted by forbidden rituals. But there were those who claimed she was something older, something primal and wild, tied to the land itself. Villagers tried to ward her off with iron horseshoes nailed above their beds and herbs hung in doorways, but nothing ever seemed to stop her. She slipped through cracks and keyholes, her presence carried by the wind. No door could keep her out. Yet, not all encounters with the mare ended in terror. There were stories of men who welcomed her, who craved her visits and surrendered to her completely. They spoke of her touch as fire and ice, her voice as a whisper that stirred something raw and forbidden. But those who gave in always paid the price. They lost themselves piece by piece, their minds unraveling until they could no longer tell where the dreams ended and the waking world began. Some vanished entirely, their bodies found days later, pale and cold, their faces frozen in expressions of longing. But the mare didn't just haunt men. Women, too, felt her presence, a silent watcher who crept into their homes and left them doubting their own thoughts. Some believed she was drawn to jealousy and loneliness, feeding on emotions that festered in the dark. Others claimed she envied the living, stealing their warmth to fill the emptiness inside her. The wind howled louder, rattling the shutters. In the cabin, the man's breath slowed, his vision blurring as the weight on his chest grew heavier. Her eyes bore into him, unblinking, unrelenting. He tried to close his own eyes, to shut her out, but she was already there, inside his head, inside his veins. And as his body finally stilled, his soul hovered in the space between fear and desire, trapped in the grip of something older than time. The candle flickered, its flame trembling as if afraid. Shadows danced along the walls, stretching and twisting into shapes that shouldn't exist. He sat alone, the scent of incense curling through the room, thick and intoxicating. The air felt warmer than it should, heavy with something unseen but deeply felt. And then she appeared. Her steps made no sound, yet he felt them, each one a ripple through the air. Her skin glowed faintly in the dim light, smooth and pale, like marble warmed by fire. Eyes as dark as midnight locked onto his, unblinking, unapologetic. She didn't speak, but her presence demanded his attention, pulling him forward without a word. Desire burned through him, sharp and sudden, leaving no room for thought. She was perfect, too perfect. Her beauty wasn't soft or delicate but sharp, a blade disguised in silk. The more he looked, the less he cared. About the warnings. About the voices in his head begging him to turn away. But he didn't. Succubi didn't take by force. They didn't need to. They offered what their prey already craved, what lay buried beneath layers of guilt and restraint. Their power wasn't in their claws or fangs, but in the mirror they held up, reflecting back every hidden want and secret hunger. She moved closer, and he could feel her breath, warm against his skin. His heart pounded, but it wasn't fear that made his chest tighten. It was longing. A longing so sharp it hurt. Succubi were agents of temptation, but they didn't create desire. They unearthed it. They stripped away the lies people told themselves, that they were strong, that they were pure, that they didn't want what they weren't allowed to have. Succubi didn't whisper promises, they let their victims make their own. He reached out, but she pulled back just enough to keep him chasing. Her smile was small, knowing. She wasn't in a hurry. She didn't need to be. The legend said succubi preyed on the weak, but that wasn't true. They sought out the strong, the ones who built walls so high they believed nothing could bring them down. And then, brick by brick, the succubus would dismantle them, leaving her victims exposed and trembling, desperate for the touch they feared the most. The church called them demons, tempters sent by hell to corrupt the innocent and drag souls into darkness. But innocence wasn't what drew them. It was the struggle. The fight. The way the body betrayed the mind, how one could beg for mercy and more in the same breath. Some said succubi fed on lust, draining their victims until nothing remained but hollow shells. Others believed they thrived on guilt, the shame that came after, the torment that lingered long after the pleasure had faded. And yet, there were whispers of those who welcomed them. Men and women who called for them in the dead of night, offering themselves willingly. Not as victims, but as sacrifices. As if surrendering to temptation could cleanse them, make them whole in ways nothing else ever had. He touched her hand, and she leaned in, her lips so close he could taste the air between them. The world blurred at the edges, and nothing mattered anymore. Not the warnings. Not the fear. Succubi didn't take, they allowed. They watched as their victims undid themselves, pulling the threads until everything unraveled. And when the morning came, when the cold light of day poured through the windows, all that remained was the echo of her touch and the ache for something that could never be satisfied. But she wasn't gone. Not completely. Her scent lingered, and so did her voice, soft and sweet, whispering promises that refused to fade. He lay back, his eyes heavy, but he knew the truth. She would return. And this time, he wouldn't resist. The night stretched on, its silence broken only by the soft creak of the wooden floorboards. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his breath shallow. The darkness felt alive, pressing against his skin, thick and unmoving. Something was coming. He could feel it. Not in the way one senses footsteps or hears a whisper, but deeper, beneath the skin, where instincts stirred like embers in dying fire. And then it happened. The faintest touch. Featherlight, tracing along his arm. His breath caught, and his body froze, but his pulse betrayed him, quickening, thundering, as if begging to be heard. He dared not move, dared not speak. The air shifted, carrying a scent he couldn't name, sweet and faintly bitter, like flowers blooming at midnight. She was there. In ancient stories, this moment wasn't just fear or longing. It was revelation. The night visit carried weight, more than desire, more than danger. It was a message whispered through flesh and bone, forcing the soul to confront what it most feared and what it most craved. Succubi didn't come uninvited. They came because something in their victims called to them. The door wasn't forced open, it was left ajar, whether through loneliness, guilt, or hunger that had been buried too long. The night visit was more than temptation, it was surrender. To see her was to be stripped bare, to feel the walls built by daylight crumble under her gaze. Her presence wasn't loud or forceful. It was subtle, creeping in through shadows and half-formed dreams, filling spaces no one dared to admit were empty. She didn't have to speak. The silence was louder than words. The symbolism of her arrival was clear to those who understood the language of shadows. She was both punishment and reward, a manifestation of suppressed thoughts and forbidden desires. She wasn't just a demon, she was a reflection. Her touch whispered secrets no one wanted to say aloud. To some, she was guilt made flesh. The weight of every hidden act and unspoken sin taking form and forcing its victims to kneel under its presence. She brought shame, but she also brought relief, the kind that came only after giving in. To others, she was freedom. A key to doors that had been locked too long. Her beauty, though unnatural, carried a promise, pleasure without judgment, desire without boundaries. But freedom had its price, and no one who let her in escaped unscathed. In the stillness of the night, she blurred the line between dream and reality. Her victims would question themselves in the morning. Was it real? Was it imagined? But the body never lied. The ache lingered. The marks remained, faint and cold, as if her touch still clung to their skin. The night visit wasn't just a moment of temptation. It was a test. Could they resist? Would they resist? Or would they lose themselves willingly, offering their souls for another taste of something they couldn't name? He closed his eyes, but she was still there, her breath warm against his neck. Her fingers trailed down his chest, leaving fire in their wake. His heart pounded, but he didn't pull away. And that was the danger. The night visit wasn't a battle to be won, it was a question to be answered. And once it began, it was never truly over. The night was endless, heavy with shadows that seemed to breathe. He sat upright, drenched in sweat, though the air was cold enough to make his skin prickle. His heart raced, pounding against his ribs like a caged animal. He wasn't alone. He felt it before he saw it, a weight, a presence that pressed against the edges of the room, unseen but undeniable. She stood at the foot of the bed. Her eyes gleamed, reflecting the faint light of the dying embers in the fireplace. She didn't move, yet it felt as though she was everywhere, filling the space with a tension so thick he could barely breathe. Her beauty was almost painful, too sharp, too perfect, as if carved by a hand that knew how to craft temptation itself. The room seemed smaller now, suffocating, but he couldn't look away. Her gaze held him like chains, and his body betrayed him, trembling not with fear, but with something darker. Something he didn't want to name. The symbolism of her presence was as ancient as the stories whispered in hushed voices around village fires. She wasn't just a visitor, she was a revelation. She tore through the veils people wrapped around themselves, stripping them down to their most primal selves. She saw everything, the thoughts they buried, the desires they refused to name, and she brought them to the surface with nothing more than a glance. To look at her was to look at oneself. She was the embodiment of the forbidden, a living reflection of hunger that had been ignored for too long. Her arrival was a test, a challenge. She forced her victims to confront their shadows, the parts of themselves they feared most. She took a step closer. His breath hitched, but he didn't move. He couldn't. It wasn't fear that held him still, it was need. The kind that gnawed at him, tearing through his resolve, leaving nothing but raw longing. Her lips curved into a smile, slow and deliberate, as though she could feel it too, the way the room pulsed with tension. The night visit wasn't about violence. It was seduction in its purest form, a battle fought not with weapons, but with whispers and glances. She didn't force her victims to their knees, they fell willingly, drawn by the promise of something they couldn't resist. The fire flickered, and for a moment, her shadow stretched along the wall, monstrous and twisting. But when he looked back, she was still beautiful, still human, or at least wearing the shape of one. He knew what she was. He'd heard the stories. Tales of men who woke to find themselves changed, hollowed out, unable to think of anything but her. Some never woke at all. But in that moment, none of it mattered. Her fingers brushed against his skin, leaving trails of ice and fire. His breath came faster, and his thoughts unraveled, fraying at the edges until only one remained. Don't stop. He closed his eyes, but she was still there, her touch lingering even as her voice whispered things he couldn't understand. She didn't speak in words, yet he felt her meaning like a fire burning through his veins. The night visit wasn't an accident. It wasn't random. It was a reckoning. A moment that laid bare every hidden fear and secret desire, forcing him to face what he truly was. And as the darkness closed in, he realized he didn't want her to leave. The night was thick with silence, the kind that pressed down on the soul, a quiet so suffocating it made the air feel heavy. Inside the chapel, flickering candlelight cast long shadows against the stone walls. The faint scent of incense lingered, rising up in curling tendrils toward the high ceiling. But something else was in the air, an unspoken tension, a weight that the clergy tried to ignore, even as it gnawed at their bones. The sermons were changing. The prayers growing more fervent. The voice of the church, once a calm whisper, now thundered with urgency, warning of dangers that lurked in the unseen corners of the world. Dangers like her. In the dark corners of the minds of those who walked the hallowed halls, a whispered name floated, Lilith. She was the first, they said, the mother of demons, the one who defied the will of God and refused to kneel. And from her, the succubi had sprung, as seductive and dangerous as their mother. The church had always feared what they couldn't control. And the succubi were the perfect embodiment of everything they couldn't touch. They weren't tangible, they couldn't be burned, banished, or cast out with a simple prayer. They were more insidious, more subtle. They didn't force their way into the lives of men, they invited them in. They crept into dreams, into the very desires of the heart, turning those thoughts into temptations so sweet and so dangerous that there was no escaping them. It was the perfect weapon. The clergy called them demons, and their war began in the shadows, before it ever reached the pulpit. The church needed to protect its followers, needed to guard their purity. The succubi, with their ability to prey on the unguarded soul, were the perfect threat. They were the embodiment of sin, unwanted lust, forbidden pleasures, and they came from a place where hell itself threatened to break through. With every passing year, the fear grew. It wasn't just a fear of succubi, of the demons who crept into the hearts of the faithful. It was a fear of something more, a fear of the unchecked desires within humanity itself. If the succubi could seduce the righteous, what did that say about the strength of their faith? What did it say about the true power of the church? The war against the succubi wasn't just about defeating demons, it was about proving the authority of the church. It was about controlling desire, about dictating what was good and pure and what was sinful. And so, the church began to shape the stories. The succubi weren't just seductresses, they were agents of damnation, sent to corrupt souls and drag them into the pits of hell. They weren't victims of circumstance, they were the embodiment of evil, of every temptation, every whisper that threatened to undo what the church had built. Women, beautiful, forbidden, and deadly, were marked. Painted as sinners, as creatures born not of flesh and blood but of darkness itself. The church claimed to save them, to protect the faithful from their wiles, but in truth, it was a war on something far deeper. It was a war on the very idea of desire, of free will, of the things people wanted in the deepest parts of their hearts but dared not speak aloud. For centuries, they burned witches, accused women of consorting with demons, and tied every weakness of the flesh to the temptations of succubi. They said that when a man fell victim to them, when his desires took hold, it was a sign of weakness, of his fall from grace. But there were those who resisted the church's teachings. There were whispers of secret rituals, of believers who still found themselves drawn to the night. The allure of the succubus wasn't easily extinguished, no matter how much the church tried to suffocate it. The desire for freedom, for pleasure, was woven too tightly into the fabric of humanity. The more the church condemned, the more the stories grew. Women who were bold, who had power over men's hearts, who defied the rules, were they succubi, or were they something more? Were they free from the church's grip, or were they merely victims of a war that had been raging for centuries? The church's war was never about saving souls, it was about control. The succubi, and their desire to tempt, were simply a manifestation of the struggle between what was natural and what was forbidden. They became symbols, not just of temptation, but of rebellion. Rebellion against the rules, against the control of those in power. And as long as there were men and women willing to surrender to their desires, the war would never be won. As the church tightened its grip, trying to protect the innocent, trying to shield the world from the darkness it claimed lurked in every corner, they forgot one thing. Desire was not something that could be stamped out. It was a fire that burned too hot, too bright, to ever truly be extinguished. And so, the succubi endured, not as demons, not as monsters, but as the quiet voice of longing in the silence of the night. Always waiting. Always calling. The night was thick with silence, the kind that pressed down on the soul, a quiet so suffocating it made the air feel heavy. Inside the chapel, flickering candlelight cast long shadows against the stone walls. The faint scent of incense lingered, rising up in curling tendrils toward the high ceiling. But something else was in the air, an unspoken tension, a weight that the clergy tried to ignore, even as it gnawed at their bones. The sermons were changing. The prayers growing more fervent. The voice of the church, once a calm whisper, now thundered with urgency, warning of dangers that lurked in the unseen corners of the world. Dangers like her. In the dark corners of the minds of those who walked the hallowed halls, a whispered name floated, Lilith. She was the first, they said, the mother of demons, the one who defied the will of God and refused to kneel. And from her, the succubi had sprung, as seductive and dangerous as their mother. The church had always feared what they couldn't control. And the succubi were the perfect embodiment of everything they couldn't touch. They weren't tangible, they couldn't be burned, banished, or cast out with a simple prayer. They were more insidious, more subtle. They didn't force their way into the lives of men, they invited them in. They crept into dreams, into the very desires of the heart, turning those thoughts into temptations so sweet and so dangerous that there was no escaping them. It was the perfect weapon. The clergy called them demons, and their war began in the shadows, before it ever reached the pulpit. The church needed to protect its followers, needed to guard their purity. The succubi, with their ability to prey on the unguarded soul, were the perfect threat. They were the embodiment of sin, unwanted lust, forbidden pleasures, and they came from a place where hell itself threatened to break through. With every passing year, the fear grew. It wasn't just a fear of succubi, of the demons who crept into the hearts of the faithful. It was a fear of something more, a fear of the unchecked desires within humanity itself. If the succubi could seduce the righteous, what did that say about the strength of their faith? What did it say about the true power of the church? The war against the succubi wasn't just about defeating demons, it was about proving the authority of the church. It was about controlling desire, about dictating what was good and pure and what was sinful. And so, the church began to shape the stories. The succubi weren't just seductresses, they were agents of damnation, sent to corrupt souls and drag them into the pits of hell. They weren't victims of circumstance, they were the embodiment of evil, of every temptation, every whisper that threatened to undo what the church had built. Women, beautiful, forbidden, and deadly, were marked. Painted as sinners, as creatures born not of flesh and blood but of darkness itself. The church claimed to save them, to protect the faithful from their wiles, but in truth, it was a war on something far deeper. It was a war on the very idea of desire, of free will, of the things people wanted in the deepest parts of their hearts but dared not speak aloud. For centuries, they burned witches, accused women of consorting with demons, and tied every weakness of the flesh to the temptations of succubi. They said that when a man fell victim to them, when his desires took hold, it was a sign of weakness, of his fall from grace. But there were those who resisted the church's teachings. There were whispers of secret rituals, of believers who still found themselves drawn to the night. The allure of the succubus wasn't easily extinguished, no matter how much the church tried to suffocate it. The desire for freedom, for pleasure, was woven too tightly into the fabric of humanity. The more the church condemned, the more the stories grew. Women who were bold, who had power over men's hearts, who defied the rules, were they succubi, or were they something more? Were they free from the church's grip, or were they merely victims of a war that had been raging for centuries? The church's war was never about saving souls, it was about control. The succubi, and their desire to tempt, were simply a manifestation of the struggle between what was natural and what was forbidden. They became symbols, not just of temptation, but of rebellion. Rebellion against the rules, against the control of those in power. And as long as there were men and women willing to surrender to their desires, the war would never be won. As the church tightened its grip, trying to protect the innocent, trying to shield the world from the darkness it claimed lurked in every corner, they forgot one thing. Desire was not something that could be stamped out. It was a fire that burned too hot, too bright, to ever truly be extinguished. And so, the succubi endured, not as demons, not as monsters, but as the quiet voice of longing in the silence of the night. Always waiting. Always calling. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows of the small, candlelit room. Inside, the air was thick, a mixture of incense and the scent of old, brittle parchment. A man sat at an altar, his hands clasped in prayer, beads slipping through his fingers as he whispered desperate pleas into the darkness. The world outside might have been full of life, but in here, it was as if the very air itself had been frozen in time. He had heard the rumors, the stories whispered in the corners of the church, the ones that spoke of the forces of darkness that lurked just beyond the veil. They weren't just tales anymore. He felt it in his bones, a creeping presence, an inevitable truth that something evil was working against him, against his soul. Something was coming for him. And then, one night, it came. It wasn't a flash of fire or the roar of an ancient beast. No, it was quieter than that. Subtle. The flicker of a shadow where none should have been, the whisper of breath against his ear when no one stood behind him. And then, a presence, a figure in the dark that was both intoxicating and terrifying. She had walked into the room without a sound, without any warning, her form outlined in the dim light. She wasn't human, yet she wore the guise of one. Her beauty was otherworldly, her eyes dark pools that seemed to draw him in, making it impossible to look away. Her lips curled into a knowing smile, one that told him she wasn't here by accident. She had come for him. He knew who she was, knew what she was, and yet, something about her defied every defense he had built in his life. She was the embodiment of temptation, an agent of hell sent to tear apart his soul. The succubus. A demon of desire, a tool of the devil, sent to draw him away from the light. The devil's work had always been subtle. There was no open confrontation, no roaring armies of hell. No, the devil had learned that the greatest weapon in his arsenal was temptation, the ability to make even the most devout falter, to make the righteous question their faith. The succubi were the perfect instruments in this scheme. They didn't demand devotion, didn't require worship or sacrifice. They were content to work in the shadows, to slip under the skin of their victims, twisting desire and lust into an addiction. They didn't just steal the soul, they trapped it in a cycle of longing, an endless loop that led straight to damnation. And the church knew this. They knew that the devil didn't need to attack directly, all he needed was to corrupt. The succubi were the weapons he sent out into the world, not to destroy, but to destroy from within. The devil's tools were always the ones that seemed most beautiful, most seductive. He did not offer war or pain, he offered pleasure, an escape from the harshness of reality. The succubi, with their soft whispers and alluring smiles, promised everything a person could desire and more. To fall into their grasp was to be promised all the delights of the flesh, yet in truth, it was a trap, a spiral that pulled you deeper and deeper into the abyss. What they didn't tell you was that once they had you, once you allowed them into your mind and heart, there was no escape. The pleasure they offered was not real, it was a shadow, an illusion that kept you chasing something that would never be fully satisfied. And when you realized this, when you saw the truth of what they were, it was already too late. But the church fought back. They fought against the devil's subtle tools, his agents of temptation. They cried out, warning the faithful of the dangers lurking in the night. They preached of the succubi, the demons that would ruin lives and twist hearts, pulling men away from God's light. The struggle was not just physical, it was spiritual, a battle fought in the unseen realms, where angels and demons waged war over the souls of the living. In the eyes of the church, the succubi were not just creatures to be feared, they were symbols. Symbols of the devil's insidious influence, of his ability to deceive and destroy. They were a warning. When you turned away from God, when you allowed temptation to take root in your heart, you invited the devil in. And he would send his tools to claim you. The succubi were the devil's instruments, playing their seductive symphony on the strings of human desires, pulling men away from what was pure and holy. But there was something even darker about the succubi. Something the church couldn't fully grasp. The truth was that they weren't just tools, they were the manifestation of everything mankind feared about their own desires. The devil didn't need to create monsters out of thin air. No, he simply needed to show people what they wanted most, what they feared most. And in that, he could shape them, twist them into something unrecognizable. The succubi were not merely demons, they were mirrors, reflecting back to humanity its own weaknesses. They were the embodiment of temptation, not as an external force, but as an internal one. They showed you what lay beneath the surface, the darkness that festered in the soul. They didn't steal souls, they revealed them. And so the war raged on, not just between heaven and hell, but within the hearts of men. Every time a succubus visited, every time the dark figure entered someone's dreams, it wasn't just a battle against evil. It was a battle against their own fears, their own desires, and ultimately, their own downfall. Heaven and hell waged their eternal war, and in the end, the succubi would always be the devil's most dangerous weapon, because they didn't need to force anyone to fall. They simply offered them the choice. The room was dim, lit only by the flickering glow of a single candle. The scent of parchment and ink filled the air as the scribe hunched over his desk, quill in hand. His fingers trembled, not from the cold, but from the weight of the story he was about to write. It wasn't just any tale, it was a tale that had been passed down for centuries, one of seduction, deception, and the dark forces that preyed upon the innocent. He could hear the whispers of the old scholars in the back of his mind, their voices filled with authority. The succubus, they had said. A demon of the night, a creature who turns desires into damnation. The scribe shuddered, his hand hovering over the page as the words began to form in his mind. The medieval world was a place where faith reigned supreme, and the battle between good and evil was fought in the minds and hearts of every person. It was a world where darkness lurked just beyond the light, and the people were taught to fear it, taught to fear the unknown, the unexplained. And in that darkness, creatures like the succubus thrived, slipping into the minds of the faithful, whispering promises of forbidden pleasures that would ultimately lead them astray. Medieval literature, a reflection of the society that birthed it, was filled with references to succubi and their seductive ways. These creatures were not just demons, they were the embodiment of the dangers of unchecked desire, of temptation that threatened to undo the righteousness of a soul. In a world where sin was rampant, the succubus became a symbol, a warning to the faithful about the dangers that awaited those who strayed too far from the path. The stories that populated medieval texts were rich with allegory. The succubus wasn't just a monster, she was a symbol of everything the church feared, the human desire for carnal pleasure, for indulgence in the flesh. The medieval mindset viewed the body as a vessel of sin, and any desire that emerged from it was seen as an invitation to damnation. The succubus, with her beauty and her promise of ecstasy, was the embodiment of that sin, a temptation that, once indulged, could not be undone. One of the most famous medieval accounts of the succubus came in the form of literature like the Alphabet of Ben Sira, where Lilith, the first wife of Adam, was depicted as a demonic figure who would seduce men in their sleep and steal their life force. Her image was twisted over time, but she remained a powerful symbol of sexual temptation. And where Lilith went, the succubi followed, weaving their stories into the fabric of medieval thought. The medieval mind didn't just fear succubi for their ability to seduce and corrupt, they feared them because of what they represented. These demons didn't just come for the body, they came for the soul, to twist and distort the very essence of a person's faith. In a world where the line between good and evil was drawn with stark precision, the succubi existed to blur that line. Their beauty and allure served as a reminder that temptation could appear in the most innocent of forms, and that even the most devout could be led astray if they weren't careful. But the succubi weren't only confined to religious texts. They found their way into the wider narrative of medieval life. In the Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri, for example, the concept of temptation was pervasive throughout the story, though the succubi weren't explicitly named. However, their influence was evident in the temptations that led the souls of the damned astray. The images of dark seduction that Dante depicted mirrored the ideas about succubi that were being spread throughout Europe. Even the famous Arthurian legends, which were rich with both chivalric ideals and tales of betrayal, offered a space for the succubus to creep in. The figure of Morgan Le Fay, Arthur's half-sister, was often portrayed as a sorceress who wielded dark powers. While not always explicitly linked to the succubus, her manipulation of desire and her control over men's hearts echoed the same themes: women who seduced and ruined men for power, pleasure, or vengeance. In other medieval texts, the succubus was sometimes depicted more directly. The Malleus Maleficarum, a notorious witch-hunting manual, described women who consorted with demons in their sleep, gaining sexual favors from these otherworldly creatures in exchange for their souls. The text presented a terrifying image of how the succubus, or any demon, could corrupt a human body and soul, twisting a person's intentions, desires, and ultimately their faith in the process. In the minds of medieval readers, there was little doubt that the succubi were agents of the devil, sent to tear apart the faithful and lure them into eternal damnation. But the most chilling aspect of these stories was how relatable they were. They weren't the tales of far-off lands or impossible creatures, they were stories about the people around them. The succubus was the perfect metaphor for the human condition, the struggle against temptation, the constant fight to stay true to one's faith in a world full of distractions. The succubi were always there, just beyond the edges of consciousness, tempting the vulnerable, whispering promises of fulfillment in the dead of night. As the scribe's quill danced across the page, writing down the final words of his tale, he knew that the story he had just penned wasn't merely one of demons and monsters, it was a story about the human condition. It was a reflection of the world they lived in, a world where desires were ever present, and where the line between good and evil was often harder to see than they were willing to admit. And in the end, perhaps the succubi were the most dangerous not because of their power, but because of what they revealed about those they tempted. The medieval literature that portrayed them didn't just create fear, it mirrored a deep truth. The succubi were the embodiment of mankind's deepest, darkest desires, and no matter how much the church tried to banish them, they would always return. Not as demons, but as whispers in the hearts of those who dared to listen. The city of Florence was alive with the energy of rebirth, a golden age where art, science, and the human spirit collided in the most unexpected ways. The streets echoed with the sounds of the Renaissance, brilliant minds, passionate painters, and poets whose words seemed to drip with desire. The air was thick with the promise of new ideas, where the divine and the sinful seemed to dance together in a delicate balance. But beneath the surface of this flourishing world, something darker was taking shape. The seductive whispers of the succubus, once hidden in the shadows, began to emerge from the depths of myth and superstition. She had always been there, lurking in the corners of society, but now she was taking on a new form. She was no longer just a demon, she had become something far more dangerous. She was the femme fatale, beautiful, deadly, and unstoppable. The Renaissance was a time when the world's understanding of desire and sexuality was being transformed. The church, with its iron grip on society, began to lose its influence, replaced by a new wave of thinking that celebrated human experience. Art and literature, once solely concerned with the divine, now explored the complexities of human passion, lust, and the intricate web of relationships that bound people together. In this fertile ground, the seductive figure of the succubus began to evolve. Renaissance erotica was a genre that flourished during this period, a genre that reveled in the sensual and the forbidden. It was a time when sexuality was no longer something to be feared and suppressed, it was something to be embraced, explored, and celebrated. But this newfound freedom came at a cost. As the boundaries between the sacred and the profane began to blur, the line between desire and damnation grew thinner. In the world of Renaissance art and literature, the femme fatale became the embodiment of this blurred line. She was seductive, beautiful, and unattainable, qualities that made her irresistible. But she was also dangerous, a force of destruction that threatened to ruin everything in her path. She wasn't just a woman, she was a symbol of forbidden desire, an invitation to indulge in pleasures that were seen as sinful and corrupting. Artists and writers of the time, like Boccaccio and Petrarca, painted portraits of women who were as deadly as they were desirable. They were the ultimate seductresses, capable of weaving webs of illusion that ensnared even the most powerful men. These women were not merely sexual objects, they were complex, layered figures who represented the darker side of human nature. In the paintings of Titian and Botticelli, women were often portrayed as temptresses, beautiful figures who enticed the viewer with their gaze, their posture, their very presence. They were goddesses, yes, but they were also demons. These women were not meant to be revered, they were meant to be feared, to be desired, and ultimately, to be destroyed. They were the personification of desire itself, the kind of desire that could consume and ruin a man's life. The figure of the succubus, now wrapped in the guise of the femme fatale, was a reflection of the tensions that ran through Renaissance society. On one hand, there was a celebration of human freedom, freedom to explore one's passions, to indulge in the pleasures of the body. On the other hand, there was the fear of losing control, of being overwhelmed by those very desires. In many ways, the femme fatale embodied this duality. She was both the ultimate fantasy and the ultimate nightmare. In the literature of the time, women like Lucrezia Borgia and Lady Macbeth were often cast as embodiments of the femme fatale, figures who used their beauty and their charm to manipulate the powerful men around them. These women were seductive, but they were also ruthless. They understood the power of their allure and used it to their advantage. But their beauty, as captivating as it was, ultimately led to their downfall, as they became consumed by the very desires they had once controlled. The rise of the femme fatale in Renaissance erotica wasn't just a reflection of changing attitudes toward sexuality, it was also a response to the political and social upheaval of the time. In a world where power was constantly shifting, where the old order was being replaced by new ideas, the femme fatale represented the chaos that lurked beneath the surface of society. She was a force that could topple kings, ruin reputations, and destroy lives. She was both a victim and a villain, a woman whose desires could lead to her own undoing as much as they could lead to the destruction of others. The allure of the femme fatale in Renaissance erotica was also a reflection of the broader themes of Renaissance thought. This was a time when the boundaries between life and death, good and evil, were being questioned. Human nature, once seen as inherently sinful, was now being celebrated for its complexity. The femme fatale, with her combination of beauty, power, and danger, was the perfect embodiment of this new understanding of humanity. She was both the epitome of desire and the harbinger of destruction, two forces that could never be separated. As the years went on, the figure of the femme fatale would continue to evolve, taking on new forms in literature, theater, and art. She would become a fixture of popular culture, a symbol of both empowerment and entrapment, of the dangers of succumbing to one's desires. But in the Renaissance, she was born, a creature of passion, of seduction, and of inevitable ruin. The femme fatale was no longer just a myth, she was a woman whose story would be told for centuries to come. The gas lamps flickered against the fog-drenched streets of Victorian London, casting eerie shadows that seemed to stretch for miles, as though they were trying to escape the smothering grasp of the night. The air was thick, heavy with an unspoken dread, an anxiety that crawled beneath the skin of even the bravest souls. The world had changed, yet some things, it seemed, would always remain the same: fear, darkness, and the haunting pull of temptation. It was in these sinister corners of the world that the figure of the succubus found new life. The Victorians, steeped in a paradox of morality and unbridled desire, looked to horror literature to give shape to their deepest fears and most hidden desires. In this new age of Gothic fiction, the succubus evolved. She was no longer merely a demon of temptation from the shadows of myth, she became something far more insidious, more real. She was not just a figure from the realm of nightmares, she was the nightmare itself. The Victorians were a society trapped between the facade of respectability and the undercurrents of darker desires. On the surface, they held tightly to rigid codes of conduct, abstaining from vice and sin in the name of decency. Yet behind closed doors, the brooding whisper of sexuality, repressed and forbidden, called out with irresistible force. The succubus, with her allure and destructive power, was the perfect reflection of this duality, an embodiment of temptation that could unravel even the most disciplined of minds. In the dim-lit pages of Victorian Gothic literature, the succubus took on new, more terrifying forms. She was no longer simply a demon to be feared from afar, she became a manifestation of the very thing society feared the most: the loss of control, the surrender to the very passions they so desperately sought to suppress. Authors like Bram Stoker, Sheridan Le Fanu, and John William Polidori began weaving tales in which the succubus was a seductress who preyed not only on the body but on the very soul of her victim. Take, for example, the works of Sheridan Le Fanu. His novella Carmilla, first published in 1872, is a haunting tale of a young woman's descent into the clutches of a mysterious, supernatural lover. The titular Carmilla is a vampire, but her seduction of the story's protagonist, Laura, is not merely a physical one. Carmilla is a master of manipulation, drawing Laura into her web with her beauty, her charm, and an almost supernatural allure. The sexual tension between the two women is palpable, suffused with the desire to transgress, to give in to something darker than anything either could have imagined. As Carmilla feeds, it is not just on Laura's blood but on her very life force, her essence. The seduction is not only physical, it is psychological, an invasion of the deepest corners of Laura's soul. Carmilla's deathly kiss is a symbol of the succubus's power, a power that draws the victim in, and once ensnared, leaves nothing behind but emptiness. This theme of seductive power, the merging of sex and death, plays out repeatedly in Victorian Gothic literature. The succubus was no longer just a demon of lust, she was a creature of the night that represented the destruction of innocence, the annihilation of purity. She was not only a figure of temptation but a force of damnation. It was not enough for her to seduce and consume, she wanted to destroy. In the Victorian imagination, the succubus was the agent of chaos, tearing apart the rigid structures of Victorian society with her dark allure. John William Polidori's The Vampire, written in 1819, is another example where this idea of the succubus takes center stage. The story's vampire, Lord Ruthven, is portrayed as a charming and handsome aristocrat, but underneath his beguiling exterior lies a creature of insatiable hunger, a predator who consumes not just the blood of his victims but their will, their very identity. Ruthven's victims, much like the victims of the succubus, are drawn into a sensual, irresistible web, where once they fall, there is no turning back. His kisses are not merely acts of pleasure but of domination, as though he feeds on the essence of those who succumb to him, leaving them hollow shells of their former selves. But the allure of the succubus in the Victorian Gothic went beyond the physical. In these tales, the succubus represented something far darker, a reflection of the forbidden, a symbol of everything that Victorian society could not openly embrace. The eroticism and terror entwined in these stories were meant to draw out the deepest fears of a society that had grown increasingly repressed. The succubus was an insidious figure precisely because she represented the darkness that thrived in the very heart of a society that wanted to pretend it did not exist. She was the rebellion against the stifling rules of propriety, a direct challenge to the morality of the time. Perhaps no better example of this fusion of the supernatural, the seductive, and the terrifying can be found than in Stoker's Dracula. While not a succubus in the traditional sense, the women who serve as Dracula's brides share many traits with these demonic figures. They are sensual, captivating, and deadly. When they seduce Jonathan Harker, it is not just his body they claim, it is his soul, his essence. They embody the same themes of forbidden desire and destruction that the succubus represents. They are creatures of the night, preying upon the vulnerable and the naive, bringing them into the fold of darkness with promises of forbidden pleasures. Once they have tasted their victims, they leave behind nothing but a shadow of the person they once were. The succubus in Victorian Gothic literature was, in many ways, a mirror of the age itself, a time of repressed desires, unspoken fears, and the clash between the old ways and the new. She was not just a demon to be feared, she was the reflection of a society torn between control and chaos, virtue and vice. In every dark, crumbling corner of Gothic literature, the succubus waits, an eternal reminder that the most terrifying things are not always the monsters we can see, but the ones lurking within our own desires, just beneath the surface. The canvas was often a space where the most forbidden of dreams could be brought to life, painted in vibrant hues that shimmered and bled into darker shades. As light hit the surface, it illuminated not just the brushstrokes, but the deepest desires and hidden fears that dwelled in the hearts of those who gazed upon the work. It was here that the succubus, that timeless seductress of the night, found her way into the art of centuries past, her image evolving from the subtle whispers of myth into bold, unapologetic strokes of temptation and terror. Visual art, throughout history, has often been a reflection of the societal beliefs, fears, and taboos of the time. The succubus, as a creature of forbidden desire and sexual allure, proved to be an irresistible subject for many artists, particularly during periods when morality and repression were at their peak. From the medieval and Renaissance periods to the decadent art of the late 19th century, the succubus was a figure who transcended cultural boundaries, appearing as both the embodiment of sin and an irresistible object of fascination. In the medieval period, religious iconography heavily influenced the portrayal of demons and supernatural beings. The succubus was often depicted as a grotesque, distorted figure, her features twisted to reflect the perversion of her nature. Her body was both alluring and monstrous, designed to invoke both desire and revulsion. Artists would frequently paint her in scenes where her seduction led to the fall of man. Her interactions with male victims were depicted as acts of destruction, not just sexual but spiritual. These images spoke to the Church's condemnation of sensuality and its belief in the power of demons to corrupt the soul. One such work, The Temptation of Saint Anthony by Hieronymus Bosch, brings the succubus to life in a nightmarish landscape of temptation. Though not a direct representation of the succubus, Bosch's work, with its surreal and grotesque depictions of monsters and demons, captures the essence of the succubus as a demonic force preying on the vulnerabilities of the human spirit. The succubus in these types of artworks is a creature who both embodies the fleshly desires of humanity and acts as an instrument of damnation. As Europe transitioned into the Renaissance, the focus shifted. With the rise of humanism and a loosening of religious constraints, artists began to explore more sensual and erotic themes in their work. The succubus, once a nightmarish demon, now found herself portrayed as a more beautiful and tempting figure. The allure of her form became central to the imagery, reflecting a society more open to the exploration of sexuality. In works like The Dream of Polyphilus by Francesco Collana, the seductive power of the female form is celebrated, and the succubus, though not directly named, lingers in the background as a shadowy figure of temptation. One of the most famous and scandalous depictions of the succubus in art during the Renaissance era came in the form of The Witch's Sabbath by the artist Francisco de Goya. Painted in the late 18th century, this work captures the dark, eerie atmosphere of witchcraft and demonic seduction. The painting shows a monstrous, horned figure, which can be interpreted as a form of the succubus, overseeing a gathering of witches engaged in dark rituals. The succubus here is not just a creature of lust, she is a harbinger of destruction, manipulating the power of desire to bring about chaos. The chilling atmosphere of the piece resonates with the fear that these creatures, once thought to be purely fictional, could easily slip from myth into the realm of reality. The 19th century brought a surge in decadent art and literature, often delving deep into the psychology of temptation and sin. The Romantic movement, with its focus on emotion, individuality, and the dark side of human nature, produced many artists who sought to capture the seductiveness of the succubus. In these works, the demoness was no longer a grotesque figure of evil, but a figure of desire that could not be denied. One of the most iconic representations of the succubus in this era came from the artist Gustave Moreau, whose work often merged sensuality with the mystical. His painting Salome depicts the biblical figure in a seductive pose, drawing on the iconography of the succubus. Moreau's use of colors, particularly reds and golds, evokes a sense of temptation and the inescapable pull of the forbidden. Here, the succubus is not depicted as a villainous figure, but as an embodiment of pure, dangerous allure, a force that demands to be both feared and desired. In the later years of the 19th century, the symbolist movement, with its fascination for the unconscious and its search for the dark corners of the human psyche, gave rise to yet another version of the succubus, one that existed within the realm of dreams, where the boundaries between reality and fantasy blurred. Artists like Odilon Redon began to depict seductive and surreal scenes where figures of women, often in the form of demonic beings, hovered on the edges of sleep. These figures had an otherworldly beauty, but the lingering sense of danger in their poses suggested a darker, more sinister force behind the allure. But the succubus's role in visual art was not only confined to the darkness of temptation and desire. Throughout history, she has also symbolized the struggle between humanity's need for pleasure and its fear of its own destructive impulses. In many depictions, the succubus is shown as a beautiful, unattainable woman who exists to lure men away from virtue. These works are often filled with a sense of tragic inevitability, as if the male victim is destined to fall, powerless to resist her charms. The succubus, in this sense, represents not just an individual act of temptation but a larger commentary on human weakness, the perpetual conflict between the heart's desires and the soul's need for redemption. The seductress of the night, once a shadowy, monstrous figure, has become a symbol of both desire and dread, of life and death. Through the ages, she has appeared in visual art not only as a demon but as a reflection of human nature itself, the raw, untamable passion that lies beneath the surface of every individual. In every brushstroke, every shade of color, and every tortured expression, the succubus endures as both a symbol of temptation and a warning, her presence haunting the gallery of the human soul. In the neon-lit world of modern media, where boundaries are blurred and everything seems to be up for reinvention, the succubus has shed its ancient roots and morphed into something both familiar and yet thrillingly new. Once a mere creature of myth, today's succubus is a chameleon, slipping effortlessly between roles and narratives, from seductive temptress to vengeful villainess, and everything in between. The archetype is no longer confined to the dusty corners of folklore, but has risen to prominence in movies, television, comics, and literature, where it continues to captivate audiences with its complex allure. Perhaps the most striking thing about the modern iteration of the succubus is how she has evolved from the fearsome demon of medieval Christianity into a multifaceted figure, whose motivations and desires are just as intricate as her victims. Gone are the days when she was simply a one-dimensional villain, a monstrous seductress whose only purpose was to lead men astray. Now, she is as human as the heroes she seduces, with her own struggles, desires, and vulnerabilities. Take, for example, the rise of the succubus in contemporary horror and fantasy genres. Films like The Lust of the Succubus, 2000, and TV shows like Supernatural have embraced the darker, more tragic aspects of the succubus, giving her an internal conflict that draws viewers into her tortured soul. The succubus of modern media is often depicted as a character who was once human, perhaps cursed or forced into her role by an outside force, leaving her stuck in a cycle of temptation and destruction. This gives her an emotional depth that older portrayals lacked. In shows like Supernatural, the succubus is a recurring character, but she is not always the villain. Characters like Meg Masters, initially presented as a straightforward demon who seduces and kills, later become more complex as her backstory is revealed. Her struggle to retain some semblance of humanity despite her demonic nature makes her character relatable, blurring the lines between good and evil. The succubus becomes a figure of empathy, someone who is simultaneously feared and pitied, embodying both the victim and the villain in a single entity. In literature, especially urban fantasy, the succubus archetype is often used as a way to explore themes of power, agency, and control. Characters like Georgina Kincaid from Rochelle Meets Succubus Blues series or the seductive vampire succubus in the Sookie Stackhouse novels by Charlaine Harris are often portrayed as women who wield their sexual power as a means of survival rather than sheer pleasure. These characters are often complex, struggling with their own morals while also contending with the consequences of their supernatural nature. The succubus in these contexts is not merely a seductress but a woman trying to find a balance between her desires and the responsibilities that come with her powers. In modern media, the succubus has also found a home in the realm of animated shows and graphic novels. Here, she is frequently portrayed as a character who walks the fine line between hero and anti-hero. In Castlevania, for instance, characters like Carmilla, the powerful vampire who also fits the archetype of the succubus, embody both the seductive and the destructive aspects of the character. She is alluring, but also ruthless, playing with the emotions and desires of others to serve her own ends. Yet, even within this, there is a hint of something more, a sense that her actions, while villainous, are driven by deeper needs, perhaps loneliness, a desire for power, or a need for revenge. One of the more interesting aspects of the modern succubus is the way she navigates the theme of consent. In many classic representations of the succubus, her seduction of men was seen as an act of domination, a one-sided affair where the male victim had little agency. But in modern portrayals, consent is often a more ambiguous subject. In some stories, the succubus is depicted as someone who enters into relationships with her victims willingly, though her motives may still be sinister. She might seduce, manipulate, or control, but there is often an underlying current of emotional or psychological complexity, with the victim's desires sometimes as much a driving force as the succubus's own. Moreover, the modern succubus is often framed as an empowered figure rather than a victim of her own desires. Her sexual allure, once perceived as a tool of male destruction, is now frequently portrayed as a weapon she uses for her own purposes, often challenging traditional gender roles. In a society where female sexuality has historically been seen as taboo, the succubus now represents a rebellion against those constraints, reclaiming her power. She is no longer just an agent of destruction, but a creature who owns her sexuality and uses it to her advantage. As a result, the succubus archetype is not just a story of seduction, it is a tale of power dynamics, agency, and control. These characters often grapple with their identities, struggling to define themselves outside the narrow confines of the roles that society and myth have assigned to them. Whether it's the demon who longs for redemption or the femme fatale who controls the hearts of men, the modern succubus is no longer a one-note character. She is a nuanced, layered persona who reflects the complex interplay of desires, fears, and strengths that exist within us all. It's clear that, in the landscape of modern media, the succubus is far from being a simple villain or cautionary figure. She has become a mirror, reflecting the darker corners of human nature, where desire and power intertwine. She is a seductress, yes, but she is also a survivor, a victim, and a warrior, someone who refuses to be boxed into one simple role. Whether she is a villain, anti-hero, or something in between, the succubus in modern media will continue to evolve, challenging our perceptions and expectations with each new iteration. With every new story, the succubus is reinvented, adapted to fit the changing tastes and fears of society. But no matter how she is portrayed, she remains a figure of undeniable power, a reminder of the dark allure that lies beneath the surface of desire. The succubus is no longer just a character in ancient tales, she is a force that lives and breathes in the modern world, capturing our attention and stirring our deepest, most forbidden emotions. In the stillness of the night, when the world is cloaked in darkness and silence, there exists a chilling phenomenon that has haunted people across cultures for centuries. It is a sensation so unsettling, so deeply ingrained in the human experience, that it has given birth to a wide array of supernatural explanations. Sleep paralysis, that terrifying state between sleep and wakefulness, has long been linked to encounters with the supernatural, and in particular, with the figure of the succubus. Sleep paralysis is a condition where an individual, upon waking or falling asleep, finds themselves temporarily unable to move or speak. Their mind is alert, but their body remains frozen. In this terrifying state, many report a sense of a presence in the room, an overwhelming feeling that they are not alone. For centuries, people have described these experiences in terms of supernatural visitations. The most common and enduring interpretation throughout history has been the succubus, a demon or evil spirit that preys upon the helpless, often during the moments of sleep paralysis. Imagine lying in bed, unable to move, your heart pounding in your chest, as a heavy weight presses upon your chest. You feel a cold breath against your skin, and despite your best efforts to scream or struggle, your body refuses to obey. Your senses are heightened, every sound, every sensation feels amplified. You are awake, yet trapped in a world where your mind is clear, but your body is not. In these moments of vulnerability, many have reported seeing shadowy figures or feeling an oppressive presence, often accompanied by a strange, overwhelming sense of arousal or terror. It's in this terrifying space between consciousness and sleep where the myth of the succubus takes root. Historically, the succubus was believed to be a demon who visited men in their sleep, seducing them and draining their life force through intimate encounters. The seductive nature of these visits tied directly to the psychological experience of sleep paralysis. The physical sensations of suffocation, the inability to move, and the lingering presence of an unseen entity mirrored the mythical descriptions of a succubus attack, where the demon would physically and emotionally overpower its victim, leaving them drained and vulnerable. But why is it that so many cultures have similar accounts of these dark, sexual encounters during sleep paralysis? The answer lies, in part, in the way our minds react to sleep and our natural fear of vulnerability. When we sleep, we are in a deeply vulnerable state. Our conscious mind rests, while the subconscious takes over. The boundary between the waking world and the dream world becomes porous, and our fears, desires, and anxieties are free to manifest in vivid, often unsettling ways. For many people, the sensation of sleep paralysis is accompanied by the vivid illusion that someone is in the room with them. These visitations are so real, so emotionally intense, that the mind struggles to comprehend what's happening. In times of stress, isolation, or trauma, the brain may construct these visits in terms of a succubus, an archetype that represents both the fear of loss of control and the seductive allure of sexual power. For men, the succubus may embody their deepest fears of vulnerability, shame, and powerlessness, while for women, it can represent a fear of being dominated or violated in a helpless state. The succubus myth, when viewed through the lens of sleep paralysis, reveals much about the human psyche's interaction with the unconscious mind. During sleep paralysis, the brain is in a state where dreamlike imagery can bleed into reality. The sensation of being paralyzed while simultaneously experiencing vivid hallucinations or nightmares is a perfect breeding ground for a myth that involves being seduced by a demonic figure. The suffocating pressure, the feeling of a weight upon the chest, mirrors the imagined presence of a succubus, an entity that physically and emotionally presses down on its victim, draining their life force in the process. The sexual aspect of the succubi encounter is also rooted in the mind's response to these terrifying episodes. In moments of intense fear and helplessness, the body reacts in ways that can be difficult to understand. While the body is paralyzed, the mind may still experience heightened sexual arousal or a sense of intimacy with the entity. This combination of fear and arousal has been a central theme in the succubus myth, with the demon's ability to manipulate desire and terror simultaneously making the encounter both disturbing and tantalizing. The myth of the succubus thrives in this space where the line between fear and desire is blurred, where vulnerability becomes a source of both dread and attraction. It's also important to consider the emotional and psychological impact of sleep paralysis. For those who experience it regularly, it can become a source of intense anxiety and dread. The feeling of being violated in a helpless state is something that can linger long after the episode has passed. For some, these experiences can even feel like a violation of their very soul. The succubus, as a symbol of this violation, reflects the deep fears people have about their own vulnerability and the sense that they are being preyed upon by forces beyond their control. Interestingly, the connection between sleep paralysis and the succubus myth is not limited to a specific cultural or historical context. Accounts of demonic visitations during sleep paralysis can be found across various cultures, with the succubus appearing in different forms. In some traditions, the entity may take the shape of a beautiful woman; in others, it might appear as a monstrous, horrifying figure. The psychological roots of the succubus encounters seem universal, suggesting that this fear is deeply ingrained in the human condition. The succubus is a reflection of our greatest fears: the loss of control, the violation of the self, and the terrifying vulnerability of being preyed upon in a state where we are least able to defend ourselves. As modern psychology continues to explore the phenomena of sleep paralysis, it's clear that the myth of the succubus is more than just a tale of demonology. It is a powerful psychological construct that taps into our primal fears and anxieties. It serves as a window into the complex relationship between fear, desire, and vulnerability, a relationship that remains as compelling and unsettling today as it was centuries ago. The succubus, born from the depths of the human subconscious, will continue to haunt our dreams, reminding us of the fragile line between sleep and wakefulness, between control and surrender. There's a strange, undeniable power that lies in the forbidden. The things that we are taught to avoid, the desires we are told to suppress, often hold more allure than the things we're encouraged to embrace. It is in the tension between what we can have and what we cannot that the most intoxicating stories are born. Myths, legends, and tales often arise from the forbidden, and at the heart of many of these stories is the mysterious and dangerous nature of sexual taboos. Throughout history, sexual taboos have served as a powerful force in shaping not only cultural norms but also the very fabric of myth. They have become the foundation upon which stories of seduction, transgression, and desire are built. These taboos are like invisible lines drawn in the sand, lines that we're told never to cross, yet it is precisely the crossing of these lines that gives rise to the most captivating stories. It's in this forbidden space where the mythical and the real collide, where the impossible becomes possible, and where our deepest, most primal fears and desires are brought to light. Consider the myth of the succubus, for example. At its core, the succubus is a creature born from the crossing of sexual taboos, the idea of a demon that comes into the private, intimate spaces of our lives and engages in forbidden acts. The succubus represents the breaking of sacred rules, the violation of the sanctity of the body, the crossing of boundaries that society has set in place. She embodies the things we are told not to do. She is temptation, lust, and desire, all in one figure. And while we may fear her, we are also irresistibly drawn to her, as she represents the allure of breaking free from societal constraints. But the succubus is not the only myth to emerge from sexual taboos. In nearly every culture, stories of beings who embody forbidden desires or taboo-breaking behaviors can be found. From the seductive Lilith in Jewish folklore, who defies the norms of marriage and motherhood, to the shape-shifting fox spirits of East Asia, who blur the lines between sexuality and danger, myths about sexual transgression are as old as civilization itself. These myths are a reflection of the boundaries that society has placed on sexuality, boundaries that are not easily ignored, yet are still constantly tested. Sexual taboos create a tension, a conflict that begs to be explored. On the one hand, there is the powerful, regulating force of society, telling us what we can and cannot do. On the other hand, there is the human urge to push back against those limitations, to experience what has been deemed forbidden, to break free from the chains of repression. Myths are born in this conflict, as they give voice to these hidden desires and transgressive acts. The power of these myths lies not only in the danger they present, but also in the freedom they offer. For the mythological figures who embody sexual taboos, there is a sense of liberation. The succubus, for instance, is not bound by the same rules as mere mortals. She operates outside of societal constraints, preying on those who dare to indulge in their most secret and illicit fantasies. Her power lies in her ability to seduce and conquer, to draw individuals into a world where the boundaries of morality and desire are blurred. This same allure can be seen in other mythical creatures as well. In Greek mythology, for example, the goddess Aphrodite, while revered for her beauty and sexual allure, also represents the destructive power of unchecked desire. She is the embodiment of both love and chaos, of passion that knows no bounds and the consequences of surrendering to that passion. In many ways, her myth mirrors the seductive nature of taboo. She represents both the beauty and the danger of indulging in what is forbidden. There is a deep psychological component at play here as well. Sexual taboos are not only societal constructs, but also deeply ingrained in the individual psyche. They speak to the fears and anxieties that we carry within us about our own desires, our own bodies, and our own sense of morality. Myths that explore these taboos tap into these inner conflicts, allowing us to confront our darkest fears and desires in a way that is both thrilling and unsettling. Perhaps one of the most powerful aspects of these myths is that they allow us to explore forbidden desires in a safe, controlled environment. We can immerse ourselves in stories of seduction, lust, and temptation, and through these stories, we experience the thrill of transgression without facing the real-world consequences. We can live vicariously through the succubus, the siren, the demoness, those who embody the taboo-breaking aspects of desire, and feel the rush of breaking free from the constraints of society, if only for a moment. But, as with all things that are forbidden, there is a price to pay. The succubus may seduce her victim, but she also drains them, leaving them weak and vulnerable. There is always a cost for crossing the line, a consequence for indulging in what we are told we cannot have. The mythology surrounding the succubus reflects this truth. The pursuit of forbidden desires can be exhilarating, but it can also lead to a loss of power, control, and ultimately, the self. The stories that emerge from sexual taboos are as much about power as they are about desire. These myths allow us to explore the dynamics of domination and submission, the give and take of sexual power, and the consequences of breaking boundaries. The succubus, in particular, embodies both the seductive power of desire and the destructive potential of yielding to temptation. She represents the allure of the forbidden, but also the dark side of surrender. And so, the myth of the succubus persists. It has evolved, transformed, and taken on new forms over the centuries, but at its heart, it remains a powerful symbol of our most primal desires and our deepest fears. It is a reminder that there are lines we are not meant to cross, but also that there is an undeniable allure to those very lines. It's a reminder that, even in our most intimate, vulnerable moments, the boundary between pleasure and danger, love and destruction, is thin and ever-changing. There's a lurking, ever-present darkness that resides in the corners of the mind, an ancient fear, an unspeakable longing. We may try to ignore it, to shut it away in the deepest recesses of our consciousness, but it waits, patiently, ready to step into the light. It's in these hidden corners that the succubus thrives, a shadow, not just of the body, but of the human psyche. She is the reflection of our deepest desires, our forbidden passions, and our most unresolved fears. And, just like our shadows, she is a part of us. The succubus is not merely a demon from old stories, she is an embodiment of what we are too frightened to confront in ourselves. In the quiet of the night, when the world is still, it's easier to hear her whispers, the whisper of temptation, of surrendering to something that feels both thrilling and dangerous. She is not merely a creature of flesh and bone, but a manifestation of our unacknowledged desires, a haunting reflection of our most private longings. She preys upon the lonely and the vulnerable, but these aren't just physical traits. These are states of mind. The succubus is a reflection of that place within the human psyche where fear and desire intersect, where the heart races with anticipation, but the mind recoils in terror. She is a seductress, yes, but she is also a mirror to what we won't admit to ourselves. Our darkest fantasies, our yearning for power, control, and abandon, she takes form and dances before us, pulling us toward a precipice where the line between pleasure and pain blurs. What does it say about us that such a figure is so universally feared and revered across cultures? Why do we create these terrifying, seductive beings and then allow them to haunt us through stories and myths? It's because we all have shadows, parts of ourselves we cannot fully see, pieces of our soul that we tuck away because we don't know how to handle them, or because we fear what would happen if we did. The succubus thrives in the darkness, in the parts of ourselves we're too afraid to acknowledge. She is a shadow, and shadows are never far from the light. Her power comes from her ability to seduce and manipulate, but it is also rooted in the way she holds up a mirror to our own hearts. The succubus represents the conflict between our desires and our fears, between the raw human need for connection and the equally deep fear of being consumed by it. For many, the succubus is a figure of seduction, a woman who draws us in with her allure and charms, offering the possibility of fulfillment, of release from restraint. But in reality, she embodies much more than the physical desire for sex or intimacy. The succubus can be seen as a symbol of the parts of ourselves that we ignore, the parts of our psyche that hunger for more than what we've been taught to want. She is the embodiment of unacknowledged desires, the lust for power, the hunger for control, the craving for chaos. And though she tempts and entices, her true gift is the way she forces us to confront those hidden, forbidden parts of ourselves. When the succubus visits, it is not just the body she touches. It's the soul. She challenges the walls we've built to protect ourselves from the rawness of human experience. She drags us into a place where control is lost and vulnerability is laid bare. In that moment, we become something else entirely, someone who can't hide behind the masks of society, religion, or morality. The succubus shows us that even in our darkest hour, there is a strange, dangerous beauty in surrender. But surrender is not without consequence. The succubus feeds not just on the body, but on the mind, on the soul. She may grant a fleeting moment of ecstasy, but she leaves behind a hollow emptiness, a sense of longing for something that cannot be named. For what we crave is not simply the pleasure of the flesh, it is the power of surrender, the abandonment of self that we are too afraid to explore in the daylight. The succubus offers us that, but at a price: the loss of self, the erosion of boundaries, and the consumption of the very thing we hold most dear, our soul. And in this, the succubus is more than just a demon or a myth. She is a manifestation of the struggle within the human psyche, the battle between repression and release, between self-control and self-destruction. She represents the yearning for liberation, for a moment of freedom where all rules are suspended, where pleasure reigns supreme, and the boundaries of the self are no longer so rigid. Yet, the succubus also serves as a warning: in the pursuit of this fleeting release, we risk losing ourselves entirely. Every encounter with the succubus, whether in dream or myth, is a dance with darkness. It is a temptation, an invitation to abandon everything and to indulge in the forbidden. Yet, just as quickly as the shadow falls upon us, it fades, leaving behind a profound emptiness, an unsettling sense that something was lost. For in the seduction of the succubus, there is no true fulfillment. There is only the endless chase for what can never be fully captured, the pursuit of desire that can never be completely satisfied. This endless cycle of desire, fulfillment, and loss is the heart of the succubus myth, and it is a reflection of the human experience itself. We are creatures of contradiction, caught between the need to express and the need to control, the desire to connect and the fear of being consumed. The succubus, as a shadow of the human psyche, offers a dark, dangerous release. She is the part of us that we dare not face, the temptation that we fear, and yet are inexplicably drawn to. The myth of the succubus lives on because she reflects a truth we are all too familiar with, that we are never fully in control of our desires. We are always, in some way, at the mercy of the shadows we cast. The succubus reminds us that no matter how far we run, no matter how tightly we bind ourselves to social norms or moral codes, we are all haunted by the very things we fear to acknowledge in ourselves. And like the shadow, the succubus is always waiting for the moment we let our guard down, for the moment when we stop running and finally face what we've always known was there. The mind is an intricate web of thoughts, memories, and emotions, weaving together scenes and stories that often defy logic. As night falls and the body sinks into rest, the conscious mind takes a step back, and the subconscious mind comes to life, creating vivid dreams. But what if these dreams could be shaped? What if the very nature of our dreams could be steered toward a desired outcome, like a story we desperately wish to write? This is the realm of dream incubation, where the line between waking intention and sleeping experience blurs. Dream incubation is the ancient practice of consciously planting a thought, image, or idea in the mind before sleep in hopes that it will manifest in a dream. Think of it as sowing seeds in the fertile soil of your subconscious, waiting for them to bloom into vivid dreams. While many people may dismiss the idea as mere superstition or folk belief, science is beginning to confirm what mystics and dreamers have known for centuries: our minds are far more malleable than we think, especially when it comes to the subconscious world of sleep. The process of dream incubation isn't just about wishful thinking. It's grounded in cognitive psychology, neural activity, and the study of sleep cycles. The idea behind it is simple. By focusing on a specific idea or problem before sleep, the brain processes this information during the deeper stages of rest and uses it to generate dreams. The images or solutions to your questions may appear in an abstract or symbolic form, but the connection to your waking desires or concerns is unmistakable. How exactly does it work? When we are awake, our brains are constantly processing information, but it's during sleep that the mind does some of its most significant processing. Dreams, in particular, are a byproduct of the brain trying to make sense of the day's experiences, emotions, and memories. The brain is also in a state of heightened plasticity during sleep, especially during the REM phase, rapid eye movement. This is when most vivid dreams occur, and it's when the brain is most responsive to external input. If you plant an idea, a problem, or a goal before sleep, your subconscious mind will likely take it and work through it during the night. This doesn't mean the mind directly produces a literal answer or experience, but it allows for the possibility of symbolic answers, solutions, or insights to emerge in the dream state. However, the process isn't as straightforward as simply wishing for something before closing your eyes. It's not just about stating an intention and drifting off to sleep, hoping for a miracle. Dream incubation requires conscious effort, a methodical approach, and most importantly, belief in the process. Like any practice rooted in psychological principles, its effectiveness depends on one's mental state, focus, and ability to let go of the expectation of control. Too much focus on the outcome can distort the process, but trust and openness allow the subconscious to work its magic. There are several techniques to foster dream incubation. The first is visualization. Before sleep, focus intently on the question or issue you wish to address. Imagine it in vivid detail, whether it's a creative problem, a relationship dilemma, or even a personal wish. Picture every aspect of the situation, from the people involved to the environment. The more sensory details you can add, the better. As you visualize, tell yourself that your mind will work on this problem during the night, that you will receive insight or answers when you wake. Another technique is writing. This is often referred to as dream journaling or dream scripting. Before sleep, write down your intentions, desires, or questions in a journal. Record as much detail as possible about what you want to dream about. Whether it's a particular scenario, a desired solution, or a specific problem, the act of writing sends a strong signal to your brain that you're focused on this issue. Over time, this practice strengthens the connection between your waking mind and your subconscious, creating a more reliable pathway for dream incubation. Affirmations also play a significant role in dream incubation. These are simple statements or phrases that you repeat to yourself before sleep. They can be related to the desired outcome, like "I will have a dream about solving this problem," or "I will dream of finding clarity." The repetitive nature of affirmations helps to reinforce your intention, and the subconscious mind, in turn, starts to align itself with your waking desires. One of the most fascinating aspects of dream incubation is its potential to influence not just personal desires or questions, but also the realm of creativity. Artists, writers, inventors, and even scientists have used the practice to foster new ideas, breakthroughs, or creative solutions. Famous figures like Salvador Dali, Thomas Edison, and Albert Einstein have all been known to use sleep as a tool for problem solving. Dali, for example, would hold a key while napping. As soon as he fell into the lightest stage of sleep, his hand would release the key, waking him up and allowing him to capture the vivid ideas that flowed into his mind during those moments. Edison also practiced a form of dream incubation by taking power naps to stimulate creative ideas. The subconscious, with its ability to bypass the logical constraints of the conscious mind, has long been seen as a fertile ground for innovation and discovery. While there's evidence that dream incubation can lead to problem solving or creative breakthroughs, it's not without its limitations. The success of the process relies on a person's ability to deeply connect with their subconscious, and in some cases, it may require more time and practice to be effective. There's also the danger of relying too heavily on the practice, expecting immediate results, or becoming obsessed with a particular outcome. The very nature of dreams is that they don't always operate according to our desires. Sometimes the mind will present us with answers in unexpected forms, or not at all. But even in these cases, the act of incubating a dream can still provide value. It brings awareness to our subconscious mind, to the parts of ourselves that may hold answers or solutions we weren't consciously aware of. It may not always offer immediate clarity, but the act itself can provide insight, deepen self-awareness, and, ultimately, provide the mental space needed for resolution to emerge, whether in sleep or in waking life. Dream incubation is not a magical tool that guarantees immediate results, but it does open up an exciting realm where the conscious and subconscious mind can meet. It's an invitation to trust that, even in the unconscious state, we are actively engaged in the world around us, processing, solving, and creating, one dream at a time. And in the quiet of sleep, perhaps there's no better way to explore the untapped potential of the mind, for within the chaos of dreams, clarity can often emerge. In the quiet recesses of ancient and medieval history, there are whispered tales of secret rituals, dark ceremonies, and forbidden practices. Among these, the summoning of succubi, the seductive demons of the night, stands out as one of the most chilling. These rituals weren't just stories told by fearful villagers or written in grimoires, they were real, and they were believed to have the power to summon entities that could shape reality itself. The allure of the succubus was so potent, so dangerous, that it gave birth to an entire subculture of occult practices aimed at controlling or invoking these spirits. The earliest accounts of succubi rituals come from medieval Europe, where the concept of the succubus became intertwined with the rising fears of witchcraft, sin, and temptation. It wasn't enough to simply speak of these creatures, there were those who believed they could summon them. These rituals, often veiled in secrecy, were said to be performed by individuals desperate for power, love, wealth, or the forbidden pleasures of the night. The rituals themselves were said to involve a mixture of incantations, symbols, and sometimes even sacrifices. The most basic elements involved calling upon the succubus by name, often invoking her through written words or through the use of specific sigils and symbols. These symbols, believed to have been passed down by ancient sorcerers or acquired through occult study, were designed to open a portal or create a conduit to the spirit world. The ritual participants would draw the sigil in a secluded space, sometimes on the floor of a darkened room, and light candles or incense to enhance the spiritual atmosphere. One of the most significant elements of these rituals was the use of words. The ancient incantations or prayers were often written in languages long forgotten or considered sacred. Latin, Hebrew, and even older forms of Greek were common, as these languages were believed to hold power over the supernatural realm. The words themselves were not just meant to call forth the succubus, but to offer a form of invitation or seduction, an attempt to bind her to the will of the summoner. But the summoning of a succubus was not something to be undertaken lightly. According to folklore, the consequences of such a ritual could be disastrous. Once invoked, the succubus was said to have the power to influence the mind and body of her summoner, often appearing as a beautiful woman who would seduce her victim in his dreams. It was believed that these nocturnal visits were more than just lustful encounters, they were also a way for the succubus to drain the life force from her victim. The idea of being visited by a succubus was often associated with a feeling of deep fatigue and, in extreme cases, even death. While some believed that the summoning of a succubus could be controlled or contained, many warned that the spirit could turn on its summoner if not properly respected or appeased. The succubus, with her demonic nature, was seen as an unpredictable and dangerous entity. Rituals, therefore, often included offerings of sacrifices or blood to appease her. These offerings could range from the burning of incense or precious items to more gruesome acts, such as animal sacrifice. In some cases, practitioners would wear protective amulets or talismans to shield themselves from the succubus's wrath, but even these were not foolproof. Over time, these rituals became more ingrained in folklore and superstition, and the act of summoning a succubus evolved from a potentially dangerous act into something of an occult taboo. Many medieval texts warn against the temptation to summon such spirits, believing that anyone who sought the succubus's favor would be marked by a dark and corrupting influence. The very idea of making contact with a demon, especially one that thrived on the energy of human desire, was seen as an act of ultimate defiance against God and the natural order. In some cultures, these rituals were not only about personal gain or pleasure. They were also tied to a sense of spiritual rebellion. For many, summoning a succubus was an act of seeking forbidden knowledge or power, something that could alter the course of their life, for better or worse. The succubus, a creature of the night, represented the dangerous allure of the unknown, the mystical forces that lay beyond the reach of ordinary men. The summoning rituals also serve as a stark reminder of the human fascination with the supernatural and the unknown. In an era where life was harsh, unpredictable, and often cut short, the idea that there was a way to commune with otherworldly beings offered a sense of control, however fleeting. But for those who partook in these rituals, the danger was ever present. The succubus wasn't just a creature of seduction, she was a reminder of the fine line between desire and destruction, between seeking power and losing one's soul. As time wore on and the world grew more skeptical of such practices, these rituals began to fade into the shadows, becoming stories whispered in dark corners or written about in forbidden texts. Yet, even today, the echoes of these ancient rites can still be found in literature, film, and the popular imagination. The succubus, with her dark promise and deadly allure, remains one of the most enduring symbols of temptation and the dangers that lie in seeking the unknown. These rituals are not simply relics of the past, they are reflections of human nature itself, the longing to reach beyond the limits of our world, to touch the divine or the damned, and to face the consequences of those desires. They remind us that every act of summoning, every attempt to commune with forces beyond our understanding, carries with it a price. A price that, in the case of the succubi, is often far higher than anyone is prepared to pay. The flicker of candlelight dances eerily against the cold, stone walls of a hidden chamber, its shadow stretching across the floor like a living entity. A figure stands at the center, draped in dark robes, whispering words that seem to bend the very air around her. In this space, ancient and forbidden, the air thickens, crackling with tension. She is a witch, and in her hands, the power of the succubi, demons born of darkness and desire, is her weapon. The connection between succubi and witchcraft has long been a subject of fascination and fear. Throughout history, succubi were often depicted as the tools of witches, summoned to do their bidding, or as spirits that granted the witch access to power beyond human understanding. To speak of witches and succubi is to speak of the darkest corners of the occult, where magic, desire, and temptation intertwine in a dangerous dance. In the medieval and early modern period, witches were believed to have the ability to summon and control succubi, among other demonic entities. The succubus, with her seductive allure and ability to drain the life force from her victims, was seen as a potent ally in the witch's arsenal of dark magic. According to some accounts, witches would make pacts with these demons, offering their souls in exchange for the succubus's power. It was said that the succubus could help witches with their spells, increase their sexual appeal, or even provide the strength needed to curse or harm their enemies. For centuries, society believed that witches, especially women, were prone to consorting with demons, and the succubus was often named as one of these infernal companions. A woman accused of witchcraft was often thought to be in league with the succubus, who would visit her in the night, providing her with the means to manipulate others. These accusations were not just based on superstition, they were fueled by deep-seated fears of female sexuality, power, and independence. The succubus, as a symbol of temptation, embodied everything society feared about women in positions of power. She was a reminder of the uncontrollable nature of desire, and the chaos it could bring. One of the most significant ways that succubi were associated with witches was through the practice of astral projection. The belief was that witches could send their souls out of their bodies in a form of astral travel, during which they would visit the succubus in the dream world. Here, the succubus would offer both pleasure and power, but at a price. The witch, in turn, would use the energy gathered from these encounters to fuel her magic or to manipulate others in her waking life. This practice was described in witch-hunting manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum, a notorious text from the 15th century that outlined the ways in which witches were said to interact with the demonic. Witchcraft and black magic were seen as intertwined with the succubi in the minds of the public. Witches, often portrayed as cunning women who lived on the fringes of society, were believed to summon succubi for practical purposes, such as acquiring wealth, power, or the ability to curse their enemies. The succubus, in turn, was seen as an emissary of the devil, sent to ensure that the witch's magic would be potent and effective. The idea of a pact with the succubus reflected the broader concept of witches making deals with demonic forces, an idea that was deeply rooted in Christian theology and the persecution of women during the witch hunts. During the height of the witch trials, accusations of succubi encounters were often used as evidence of a witch's pact with the devil. Witnesses would testify that they had seen witches in the company of succubi or that they had been visited by these creatures themselves. In these accusations, the succubus served as proof of the witch's maleficence, and the claim of a sexual encounter with the demon was often used as a way to reinforce the witch's guilt. These claims were often fabricated or exaggerated by accusers looking to exact revenge, secure their own power, or eliminate rivals. But for those accused, the stigma of succubus encounters was enough to ensure their downfall. The ritualistic use of the succubus in witchcraft was also linked to the practice of love spells and charms. Witches were believed to be able to call upon the succubus to entice or seduce their targets, using the demon to fulfill their desires. Whether it was to make a man fall in love, to ensure wealth, or to break up a marriage, the succubus was often viewed as the perfect agent of desire. Through her, witches could manipulate the forces of passion, turning them into tools for personal gain. In this way, the succubus was not only a symbol of sexual temptation but also of the dangerous allure of forbidden power. In some traditions, succubi were said to assist witches in performing rituals to summon other supernatural entities or spirits. The succubus's connection to the demonic world was thought to give her special access to other dark powers. In these rituals, the succubus might act as an intermediary between the witch and more powerful demons or even the devil himself. This relationship allowed witches to gain access to forbidden knowledge or to obtain magical powers that were otherwise unattainable. As the centuries passed and the witch trials died down, the association between succubi and witchcraft persisted in folklore and occult practices. The succubus continued to be a symbol of dark magic and temptation, and her relationship with witches remained one of power, manipulation, and secrecy. Even in modern occult practices, the succubus is sometimes invoked in rituals that seek to control or seduce, though these rituals are often practiced in secrecy, hidden from mainstream society. The succubus and witchcraft share a complicated history, one marked by fear, fascination, and desire. The succubus was not just a demon, she was a tool of power, a symbol of the seductive allure of magic, and a reflection of society's fears about female sexuality and autonomy. In witchcraft, the succubus was both a powerful ally and a dangerous foe, a creature capable of fulfilling desires but also of destroying lives. Her role in the occult continues to be a source of intrigue and mystery, reminding us of the ways in which the supernatural and the human psyche are forever intertwined. Under the cold light of a dying moon, the air in the room felt thick, heavy, as though something unseen was watching, waiting. He stood there, a man on the edge of desperation, his thoughts a mix of regret and longing. His life had been a series of failures, his attempts to claw his way to power thwarted at every turn. And then, she appeared, her eyes, dark pools of mystery, her body like the very embodiment of temptation. She whispered his name, soft and slow, as if to drag him deeper into her web. The myth of the sexual pact with a succubus is ancient, its origins shrouded in mystery, yet its allure is timeless. It is the story of those desperate enough to sell their souls for the promise of power, wealth, or forbidden pleasure, only to find themselves bound in chains of damnation. These pacts, made in the darkest corners of the human soul, speak to the dangers of giving in to temptation, to the pursuit of desires that come at a terrible cost. The succubus, as a demon of seduction and destruction, represents not just sexual temptation, but a corrupting force that can unravel the very fabric of a person's life. The allure of the sexual pact is rooted in the promise of ultimate satisfaction, a life free from want, a world where all desires are fulfilled. For those who struggle with their inadequacies, who seek power beyond their means, the succubus offers a way out, a shortcut to greatness. But greatness always comes with a price. In these ancient stories, the succubus is not just a seductress but a harbinger of doom. She offers her lovers everything they crave: wealth, fame, influence, and the kind of power that mortals only dream of. But the price is steep. The soul, the essence of their being, is the payment she demands. The man who enters into this pact is no longer master of his own fate. He is a puppet, and the succubus pulls the strings. There is an undeniable draw to these stories, for they speak to a deep, primal part of the human soul, the desire for more, the yearning for something beyond the mundane. The pact with a succubus, like all such deals with the demonic, offers a shortcut to greatness, but at what cost? The man who signs the invisible contract with his blood may see his life transformed, but the transformation is not what he imagines. The power he gains is hollow, fleeting, and ultimately unsatisfying. What follows is often a life of torment. The succubus, having satisfied her own desires, will drain her victim's life force, pulling him ever closer to the abyss. The pleasures she offers are fleeting, always just out of reach, and the man who once reveled in his newfound powers soon finds himself enslaved to her whims. He becomes a shell of the person he once was, consumed by a hunger that can never be sated. His success comes at the expense of his soul, and there is no escape from the consequences. In many of the stories of sexual pacts, the man begins with a sense of control, convinced that he can use the succubus for his own purposes. But the truth is far darker. The succubus is not a simple instrument of desire. She is a master manipulator, a being who understands the weaknesses of the human heart. She knows how to exploit a man's fears, his shame, and his deepest, most hidden desires. She lures him in with promises of joy, only to strip him of his humanity, piece by piece. There is a reason why these stories have endured for centuries. They speak to the dangers of unchecked desire, of the belief that power and pleasure can be obtained without consequence. The man who makes a pact with a succubus is not just risking his life, he is risking his very soul. The succubus, in all her seductive beauty, represents a force that cannot be controlled, a power that will inevitably consume everything in its path. In some versions of the myth, the pact is not just a one-time affair, but a long-lasting relationship. The succubus returns again and again, each encounter more intense, more consuming than the last. She becomes an obsession, a presence that lingers in the mind, and no matter how much the man tries to resist, he is drawn back into her embrace. The pact becomes a cycle of pleasure and destruction, a loop that is impossible to break. The more the man succumbs, the less he is able to return to his old life, until he is nothing but a shadow of his former self. These stories also serve as a warning. In the world of myth, those who enter into sexual pacts with succubi are often damned to eternal suffering. Their souls are taken, their bodies left to wither and die. In many cases, the pact is not broken until the man has paid the ultimate price, his soul, his sanity, or his very life. The succubus may offer him everything he desires, but in the end, it is all an illusion, a cruel game where the price of indulgence is always far greater than the pleasures gained. The myth of the sexual pact with a succubus is a timeless tale of temptation, power, and damnation. It reminds us of the dangers of unchecked desire, of the consequences of seeking power at any cost. In the end, no mortal can escape the wrath of the succubus once they have made their deal. She is not just a seductress, but a destroyer, a demon who takes what she wants and leaves nothing but ruin in her wake. And so, the man stands in the darkness, consumed by his own desires, forever bound to the succubus he thought he controlled. The pact was made, the price paid, and there is no turning back. The room was dimly lit, the only sound the soft rustle of pages turning as candles flickered on the edges of the room. Around a table sat those drawn to the darker corners of the unknown, their faces marked with curiosity, fear, and anticipation. They weren't looking for answers, they were searching for a connection to something beyond this world. The occult, with its rituals and promises of power, offered an escape. A life of the unseen. But what they didn't realize was that the cost of such a life was far greater than they could ever imagine. Succubi, once creatures of ancient folklore, have found a place in modern occult practices, weaving their way through rituals, beliefs, and the minds of those seeking to summon or control them. In a world driven by the quest for power, transcendence, and hidden knowledge, these seductive entities have evolved from shadowy demons of myth into more complex figures of fascination. What once was a demon of temptation has become a symbol of forbidden knowledge and dark empowerment. In the occult, succubi are often seen not just as agents of sexual temptation, but as beings of raw energy, their power linked to the manipulation of desire, emotion, and the unseen forces of the universe. Modern occultists don't just view succubi as mere creatures to be feared or avoided, they are tools. Tools that can be summoned, bargained with, or even worshipped in the pursuit of power. But these rituals are dangerous, their consequences severe, as they tap into a power that most are ill-equipped to understand. The allure of the succubus in modern occult practices often stems from the belief that by summoning such entities, individuals can access a deeper form of control over themselves and the world around them. The succubus is not just a demon to be feared, she is an embodiment of power, a representation of the dark side of human nature, the temptation to surrender to one's base desires, to seek out forbidden pleasures without regard for the consequences. For occult practitioners, this is a tempting offer. Control your desires, and you control your fate. Rituals surrounding the summoning of succubi often involve elements of sexual energy, belief in the power of the feminine, and an understanding of the energy dynamics between the material and spiritual worlds. Practitioners may call upon the succubus to aid in matters of lust, empowerment, or even revenge, tapping into the sexual power of the entity to shape reality in their favor. In these practices, the succubus is not merely a demon but a force of nature, a being who understands the very pulse of human desires and emotions. However, these rituals are not without their dangers. Succubi are known for their ability to drain life energy, to consume the very essence of their victims, leaving them weak, exhausted, and vulnerable. Many occultists believe that while succubi can provide short-term gains, whether that be through heightened sexual pleasure, empowerment, or supernatural influence, these benefits are always temporary and come at a cost. The more a person interacts with a succubus, the more they risk losing themselves in the process. The succubus, like all creatures of the occult, does not give without taking. What she offers is always a twisted version of what the practitioner seeks, leaving them with a hollow sense of fulfillment. The belief that succubi are connected to dark, powerful forces makes them desirable in occult practices. But there is a deeper meaning to the succubus role in these rituals, a dark reflection of the human soul itself. Succubi represent the unconscious, the desires we try to suppress, the forbidden pleasures we crave but dare not admit. In the act of summoning, occultists are not just engaging with a demon, they are engaging with their own dark nature, their shadow self. It is this confrontation with their own primal instincts that can be both empowering and dangerous. It is said that the succubus can help practitioners achieve their desires, but at a cost, the soul. The deeper one delves into the occult, the more one becomes entwined with these beings, and the more one's humanity is eroded. Those who succumb to the succubus are often marked by a gradual descent into obsession. At first, they may feel empowered, perhaps gaining material wealth, sexual gratification, or status. But the price they pay is heavy, their own essence is slowly consumed, leaving them hollowed out, addicted to the power and pleasure she provides. Some occult practitioners see the succubus as a spiritual guide, a teacher who can help unlock hidden knowledge. In these practices, she becomes a symbol of transformation, a being that can open doors to deeper understanding, to mysteries of the universe that the uninitiated can never touch. But again, this comes with its own peril. The succubus does not offer true enlightenment. She offers only illusions, promises that can never be fully fulfilled, leading her victims deeper into darkness. There are those who practice the occult with the goal of mastering the succubus, believing they can control or dominate her. They seek to strip away her power and use her as a tool to achieve their own ends. But in doing so, they often forget that she is not to be controlled. She is a force beyond the mortal realm, and those who seek to master her will find themselves at her mercy instead. The succubus does not serve, she claims dominion over those who summon her. And once a pact is made, there is no turning back. The modern occult view of the succubus is a complex and paradoxical one. She is both a temptation and a teacher, a seductress and a destroyer. She represents the chaos that lies beneath the surface of the human soul, the parts of ourselves we try to deny but can never fully escape. For those who dabble in the occult, the succubus offers not just power, but a mirror to their own darkest desires, a chance to confront and embrace the parts of themselves that they fear. But as with all dealings with the occult, the cost is always higher than it appears. The succubus may grant what is asked of her, but she will take far more than she gives, leaving her victims to slowly wither away in the pursuit of their own darkest wishes. There is no true power in summoning her, only an illusion of control, a fleeting moment of satisfaction, before she claims her due. And in the end, all that remains is the hollow echo of a life consumed by desire and damnation. In the quiet of the night, a flicker of candlelight illuminates the darkened corners of a room. A group of modern-day practitioners sits in silence, their eyes fixed on the small circle of light before them. They aren't looking for gods or ancient spirits, they're searching for something far more elusive. Something primal. The air is thick with anticipation. A single word hangs in the air, whispered in hushed tones, succubus. For them, this isn't just a myth or a demon to be feared. It's a powerful, enigmatic figure, one that has evolved from folklore into a symbol of modern spirituality. In contemporary spirituality, the succubus is no longer just the evil temptress or the agent of sexual corruption. She is a figure of empowerment, an entity that can be approached for guidance, understanding, or even strength. Today's occultists and spiritual seekers often view the succubus as a manifestation of energy, desire, and the deeper currents of the human psyche. Her allure is no longer confined to fear and taboo, but has transformed into something far more nuanced, a symbol of the mysteries of the self, of unacknowledged desires, and the raw power of the feminine. To many modern practitioners, the succubus is not an evil creature. Instead, she is seen as a teacher, a muse, and a source of spiritual awakening. Her power is closely tied to feminine energy, intuition, creativity, sensuality, and her ability to awaken these traits within those who encounter her is revered. She is no longer demonized, but celebrated as a force that can guide one through the most profound aspects of their being. In this view, the succubus is not to be feared but respected, as she can illuminate the shadowy recesses of the soul, exposing desires and emotions that have long been suppressed. Within the context of modern-day occultism, succubi are often seen as representatives of the hidden, the forbidden. They embody a deep connection to the mysteries of life, particularly in relation to human sexuality, power dynamics, and the subconscious mind. Occult practitioners who work with the succubus may invoke her as part of rituals designed to empower their sexual expression, manifest desires, or tap into their innate creative abilities. She is no longer just a seductress in the traditional sense, but an energy that can be harnessed to enhance one's personal growth or transformation. But even in this context of empowerment, there remains an undeniable tension. The succubus, with her ability to seduce and enthrall, can also drain the life force of her victim. This duality, the seductive allure mixed with the potential for harm, keeps her a figure of caution and fascination. Some occult practitioners warn against becoming too attached to the succubus, arguing that while she may offer knowledge and power, there is a risk of losing oneself in the process. Her seductive nature can lead to obsession, creating an unhealthy dependence on the energy she provides. Contemporary spiritualists often approach the succubus with a sense of reverence, acknowledging her as a being who is beyond the limitations of traditional morality. She represents the untamed aspects of life, the raw, unfiltered desires that society often tells us to suppress. In working with the succubus, practitioners seek to reclaim these desires, to bring them into the light and integrate them into their lives in a healthy and empowering way. She is a guide to the unconscious, helping to bridge the gap between our hidden desires and the conscious world. At the heart of the succubus role in modern spirituality is her connection to the concept of shadow work, the practice of facing and integrating the darker, repressed parts of the self. The succubus is seen as a powerful figure who can help reveal these hidden aspects, guiding her followers through the process of self-discovery and self-acceptance. By confronting the aspects of themselves that they have long denied, practitioners can grow spiritually, releasing shame and guilt associated with their desires, and ultimately achieving a deeper sense of wholeness. In modern spiritual circles, the succubus is also increasingly tied to the concept of tantric practices, where sexuality is viewed as a sacred force. Within this framework, the succubus is not a demon but a partner, a sacred consort, with whom one can unite in the pursuit of spiritual transcendence. This view places a heavy emphasis on the energy exchange between the practitioner and the succubus, with the understanding that such a relationship, when approached with reverence and respect, can be mutually beneficial. It's an energy that flows between them, a dance of power, desire, and connection, one that seeks to awaken higher states of consciousness. For many modern occultists, the succubus represents a balance of light and dark. She is both a challenge and a catalyst, pushing practitioners to confront their deepest fears and desires. But there is also a danger in this. In the pursuit of such intense spiritual connections, one can be swept away by the intensity of the energy. This delicate balance between empowerment and temptation makes the succubus both a symbol of strength and a reminder of the fragility of the human spirit. Today's spirituality doesn't view the succubus as a one-dimensional demon or mythological creature. Instead, she has transformed into a complex and multifaceted figure, one who serves as a mirror to the soul, revealing hidden truths, challenging limiting beliefs, and guiding seekers through their personal evolution. In modern occultism, the succubus is not just an entity to summon, but a symbol of the potent forces that lie within each of us, waiting to be unlocked, embraced, and integrated. Yet, the succubus remains a paradox. She is the seductress and the destroyer, the muse and the tormentor, offering both power and peril in equal measure. For those who seek her out, she can be a source of profound spiritual awakening, but only if they are willing to face the darkest parts of themselves. In modern spirituality, the succubus is no longer a being to fear, but one to understand, a mirror reflecting the desires, the shadows, and the untapped potential of the soul. The path to wisdom, however, is never without its dangers, and the succubus, as she always has, remains a powerful reminder of the fine line between liberation and destruction. In the quiet corners of history, where whispered secrets of the night linger, there lies a figure that has always haunted the edges of our consciousness, the dark feminine. Her presence is not just one of allure, but one of power, chaos, and profound mystery. She has been portrayed in myriad ways across cultures and traditions, both as a symbol of empowerment and a figure of fear. In every myth and every tale, she embodies a force that both terrifies and fascinates. But what is it about this dark, seductive power that draws people in, and why does it leave so many trembling in its wake? For centuries, the dark feminine has been a duality, her energy representing both the sublime and the terrifying. She is the archetype of the primal woman, the embodiment of untamed desires, deep wisdom, and fierce independence. In folklore and mythology, she is often depicted as a seductress, a creature who lures the weak-minded into her grasp, only to destroy them. But she is also a protector, a mother, and a source of creation, symbols of life, rebirth, and destruction all tangled together in one powerful being. From Lilith in the Bible to the witches of the Middle Ages, the dark feminine has been feared, revered, and misunderstood in equal measure. But why do we fear her? Why does her power seem so overwhelming, so dangerous? The answer lies in what she represents, the unknown, the uncontrollable, the parts of ourselves we refuse to face. She is the embodiment of shadow, of the aspects of life we have been taught to repress: anger, lust, vengeance, independence. In many cultures, these traits have been labeled as unfeminine or evil, so when a woman dares to express them, she becomes a threat. The dark feminine challenges the status quo and calls into question the very foundations of power, control, and submission. It is no surprise, then, that many spiritual traditions have long sought to suppress or demonize the dark feminine. In patriarchal societies, her power was seen as a challenge to male authority and order. The dark feminine was not only feared but punished. She became the witch, the temptress, the demon. Women who dared to live outside the prescribed roles of mother and wife were often cast as dangerous, accused of consorting with demons, performing evil deeds, and threatening the moral fabric of society. Through this lens, the dark feminine became synonymous with chaos, with destruction, with the dissolution of boundaries. Yet, in other spaces, she has also been a figure of liberation. To embrace the dark feminine is to embrace the fullness of womanhood, to acknowledge the parts of ourselves we have been taught to reject. It is to stand tall in the face of societal norms and say, "I am more than what you expect of me." She is the wild woman who cannot be tamed, the fierce goddess who will not be contained. In the sacred texts of various cultures, she is often depicted as a force of transformation, a goddess who births life and consumes it in the same breath. She is Kali, devouring time and space to create new beginnings. She is Persephone, descending into the underworld, where she finds her power in the darkness. In these stories, the dark feminine is not a force to be feared but one to be embraced, for she is the ultimate creator and destroyer, the force of nature that drives all things forward. In modern times, the dark feminine has found a place in feminist movements, where she is celebrated as a symbol of empowerment and autonomy. No longer relegated to the shadows, she has emerged as a beacon of strength for those who dare to challenge the constraints of society. She is the woman who says no to the expectations placed upon her, who refuses to be the passive, docile figure that has long been demanded. She is the force that drives women to speak their truths, to stand in their power, and to demand the respect that is their birthright. But even in this context of empowerment, there remains an underlying tension. The dark feminine is not always comfortable. She is not easy. She is fierce, intense, and often difficult to understand. To embody her is to face the uncomfortable truths about ourselves and about the world around us. She demands that we confront the things we wish to ignore, the parts of our psyche that we have buried beneath layers of social conditioning. She forces us to look at our anger, our fear, our guilt, and our shame, and to find peace within those emotions. For some, this is terrifying. The dark feminine calls us to examine the very depths of our souls, and that journey is not for the faint of heart. It requires a willingness to step into the unknown, to face the parts of ourselves that we have spent our whole lives avoiding. And for many, that is where the fear lies. It is not just the fear of the dark feminine herself, but the fear of what she might reveal within us. To truly embrace her is to risk losing control, to risk seeing ourselves as we really are, powerful, flawed, and unapologetic. The dark feminine exists within all of us, regardless of gender. She is the part of us that longs to break free, to shed the constraints of society and stand in our power. But she is also the part of us that is willing to face the darkness head-on, to confront our fears and desires, and to emerge stronger for it. Whether we view her as a symbol of fear or empowerment, one thing is certain: she is a force that cannot be ignored. She is the untamed, unshackled power within us all, and it is only by embracing her that we can truly come into our own. The lights flicker, the shadows stretch across the walls, and from the darkened corners, she emerges, enticing, powerful, irresistible. With each step, the world around her seems to bend to her will, as if the very fabric of reality is shaped by her presence. This is the succubus, but not the ancient, terrifying demon of myth. This is the succubus of modern media, a hypersexualized figure that serves as both a symbol of power and a tool for fantasy, designed to captivate, seduce, and shock. In the world of pop culture, succubi have undergone a dramatic transformation. Once feared as dangerous, demonized temptresses who ensnared men in their sleep, today's succubi have been reimagined as alluring figures of desire. They are no longer simply creatures of evil. They are often the heroines of their own stories, basking in their sensuality and using it as a weapon. From comic books to video games, TV shows to films, the portrayal of succubi in popular culture has shifted toward the hypersexualized. They are frequently depicted with exaggerated curves, exaggerated powers of seduction, and an insatiable appetite for both pleasure and control. But with this change in portrayal comes a complex web of consequences. The succubus, once a symbol of fear and forbidden allure, is now being used as a tool for entertainment, often reducing her to little more than a sexual object. The emphasis on her physical beauty, her seductive nature, and her ability to manipulate desires paints a picture of the female body as something to be possessed, consumed, and controlled. This hypersexualization is not just a superficial trend, but a reflection of deep-seated societal views about women, power, and sexuality. In a world where the lines between fantasy and reality are becoming increasingly blurred, the portrayal of succubi serves as a lens through which we view women's roles in society. The media's portrayal of these creatures often mirrors the way women are expected to behave: polished, perfect, and above all, sexually available. While these portrayals may empower some, they also perpetuate harmful stereotypes about women, reducing them to mere objects of desire. The hypersexualized succubus is not just a character, but a commentary on the way society views female power as something that must be sexualized in order to be valued. Consider the characters that populate modern fantasy series. They are often seductive, strong, and in control, but their power is almost always tied to their sexuality. Think of the countless video game characters who wield power through their bodies, whether it's the enchantress who lures a hero to his doom or the siren whose beauty is used to manipulate those around her. These characters are depicted as powerful, but their strength is inherently sexual in nature. They dominate, they seduce, and they leave destruction in their wake, but their empowerment is always framed within the context of their sexual appeal. This constant sexualization has a profound impact on the way society views both women and sexuality. It sends the message that power, beauty, and worth are intrinsically tied to sexual appeal. For men, this might reinforce a sense of entitlement to women's bodies, while for women, it might create unrealistic expectations of how they should appear or behave in order to be seen as powerful or desirable. The hypersexualized succubus is a product of this cycle, a figure that embodies both the allure and the danger of a woman who dares to embrace her sexuality. The idea of succubi as hypersexualized characters also raises questions about the role of consent and agency. In many media portrayals, succubi are depicted as controlling the minds and desires of their victims, often without their consent. This plays into the age-old fantasy of a man being seduced and taken against his will. While this can be thrilling within the context of fantasy, it also feeds into real-world power dynamics, where women are often objectified or expected to conform to a standard of sexual availability. The succubus, in this sense, becomes both the victim and the villain, a figure of power who uses her sexuality to manipulate and control, yet whose actions are often depicted as a threat to the stability of the male characters around her. This portrayal of succubi as seductive, manipulative figures also has a lasting impact on the way society discusses consent, agency, and sexual autonomy. The succubus is often shown as a creature who exists to fulfill the desires of others, with little regard for her own needs or autonomy. She is a projection of male fantasies, and in many ways, she reinforces the harmful idea that women's value is determined by their sexual desirability and their willingness to cater to the desires of others. This narrative, though fantastical in nature, echoes real-world pressures placed on women to conform to societal standards of beauty and sexuality. Yet, the hypersexualization of succubi in pop culture is not without its contradictions. In a world where empowerment is often equated with sexual freedom, the succubus stands as a symbol of both liberation and oppression. She is free in her ability to manipulate, control, and dominate through her sexual allure, but that very power is tied to her objectification. Her body becomes a battleground between liberation and exploitation. She is empowered, yet subjugated. She is both the victim and the victor, a paradox that speaks to the complexity of human desire, power, and control. In the end, the succubus's portrayal in pop culture is a reflection of how society grapples with the complexities of power, sexuality, and identity. She embodies both the fantasies and fears of a world that is still coming to terms with how to handle female power. Whether she is viewed as an object of desire, a symbol of empowerment, or a dangerous force to be reckoned with, her presence in modern media serves as a reminder of how far we have yet to go in understanding the complex relationship between sexuality, agency, and power. Through the succubus, we glimpse not only the darker corners of the human psyche but the cultural forces that shape our understanding of desire, identity, and control. Late at night, as the internet hums with the quiet flicker of digital screens, a new kind of fascination emerges. On forums and social media platforms, where people gather in the anonymity of cyberspace, an age-old myth takes on a new life. The succubus, once a creature of nightmares, is now transformed into something else, an object of desire, humor, and digital obsession. Memes circulate rapidly, drawing from the power of internet culture, and the succubus becomes both a symbol of forbidden allure and a quirky, often comedic figure. This digital age has breathed new life into the concept of the succubus, with countless online spaces now dedicated to discussing, sharing, and reshaping the myth in real time. A simple search online brings up pages of fan art, animated GIFs, and memes featuring the seductive demon, each iteration of the succubus evolving to match the quirky humor and strange subcultures of the internet. What was once a terrifying and powerful creature is now portrayed as playful, even a little absurd at times, as it takes on a more approachable and humorous character. Some memes show succubi as exaggerated caricatures of sexuality, emphasizing their physicality and desire, while others show them as misunderstood creatures, lost in a world that doesn't quite understand their complex nature. On internet forums and niche communities, the succubus is often treated as both an enigmatic figure and a joke. These online spaces celebrate and laugh at her simultaneously, embracing the darker, mysterious side of the myth while poking fun at its implications. In some discussions, succubi are the subject of mock-serious debates about their supernatural powers and influence on the human psyche. For others, the succubus represents an idealized fantasy, a figure of desire and temptation, but also a metaphor for a certain kind of power and agency. People share stories of online roleplay encounters, sometimes imbued with elements of seduction, but more often revealing a playful, even flirtatious engagement with the character. In these settings, the succubus is not a figure of fear but a character to be admired, a digital fantasy embodying both sexual freedom and an undeniable control over those she encounters. What makes this fascination so pervasive is the internet's ability to bring together like-minded individuals who share a common interest in the more bizarre or taboo aspects of culture. The digital fascination with succubi is a perfect example of how the internet creates a space where myths and fantasies can be reinterpreted and repurposed. Within online communities, the succubus becomes a fluid concept, simultaneously a figure of empowerment, a joke, and a representation of certain fears or desires. Her hypersexualized nature is often exaggerated for comedic effect, with memes of seductive succubi striking poses, flirty dialogue, or reacting in over-the-top ways to everyday situations. Yet, at the same time, her mysterious allure, her power, and her manipulation remain core elements of the myth. This mix of humor and desire creates an almost surreal experience, where the succubus is no longer simply an archetype of danger or temptation. Instead, she is a figure of both chaos and control, playing into the strange dynamics of modern internet humor. Meme culture, after all, thrives on subverting expectations and mixing the sacred with the profane. What once served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unrestrained lust now becomes something that can be laughed at, shared, and celebrated in the safety of the digital world. Users play with the idea of the succubus, turning her into a subject of satire and wit, poking fun at the seriousness of the mythology while also embracing the power she represents. This fascination goes beyond just memes. Some online communities, especially those centered around the occult, fantasy, or supernatural fandoms, see the succubus as a character who has evolved to embody themes of sexual freedom, power, and self-determination. In these communities, she becomes less of a demonic force and more of an icon, one who speaks to the liberation of women and their ability to command desire and control. This transformation of the succubus into a symbol of power and autonomy reflects the changing tides of modern internet culture, where empowerment and sexuality often collide. At the same time, the internet allows for the succubus myth to be explored with a certain anonymity. Online roleplay scenarios give people the freedom to explore fantasies and ideas they may not feel comfortable expressing in the physical world. Here, the succubus is both a vehicle for personal expression and an avatar of desire, an idealized form of sexuality and strength. In some role-playing games and fan fiction, she is portrayed as a nuanced character with her own motivations, not simply a one-dimensional seductress. In these creative works, succubi can be multifaceted characters, powerful, mysterious, and at times tragic. These reinterpretations of the succubus add layers of complexity to her character, transforming her from a simple sexual symbol to an entity that embodies more intricate human emotions, struggles, and experiences. And yet, the online world's obsession with succubi has its darker sides. For all the humor and playful roleplay, there's a sinister undertone at times. Many succubi memes are sexualized in ways that reinforce harmful stereotypes about women and their role in relationships and society. The exaggeration of the succubus as a hypersexual creature feeds into problematic views of women as being objects of desire, reduced to their physical appearance or sexual appeal. The digital fascination with succubi, while playful in many ways, can be a double-edged sword, reinforcing harmful tropes and shaping perceptions of gender and power in ways that mirror real-world societal issues. As this digital fascination grows, so too does the complexity of the succubus myth in the online sphere. She has evolved from a dangerous demon to a figure of fun, empowerment, and objectification, all within the space of a meme or a forum post. The succubus represents something primal and seductive, but in the digital age, she is a symbol of more than just lust. She is a reflection of how the internet creates and recreates mythologies, turning ancient fears into modern-day fantasies and using digital platforms to give voice to desires and ideas that may have once remained hidden in the shadows. Her allure is undeniable, whether it's for the thrills of taboo, the humor of memes, or the power of a seductive, supernatural creature. Online, the succubus no longer just exists in our nightmares. She's become part of our waking hours, both a symbol of forbidden desire and a playful, often satirical character who embodies the paradoxes of the human experience. There is something about the succubus that stirs the soul, something haunting, captivating, and undeniably magnetic. This myth, deeply rooted in ancient cultures, has refused to fade into the forgotten corners of history. Despite the centuries that have passed, the story of the succubus persists, weaving itself through the fabric of human existence in ways that no one can quite explain. But one thing is certain, the succubus never truly disappears. She transforms, adapts, and lingers, like a whisper in the dark, an irresistible force that calls to our deepest desires and fears. The succubus speaks to a primal part of humanity, a part that can never quite escape the shadow of longing. Her allure is more than just her beauty or her seductive powers, it's the tantalizing promise of what lies beyond the veil of everyday existence. She represents everything we crave but can't touch, forbidden pleasure, uncontrolled desire, and the powerful seduction of the unknown. The succubus isn't merely a demon, she's a manifestation of human curiosity, of that deep-seated hunger for something more than the mundane, something dangerous yet thrilling. And that is why the myth of the succubus endures. It speaks to something deep within the human condition that refuses to be ignored. Across different cultures, the succubus morphs and takes on various forms, but the core essence remains the same. From ancient Mesopotamia to medieval Europe, to modern-day fantasies, the succubus has always been a figure that challenges societal norms. She is both a threat and a promise, an invitation to step outside the lines and experience something forbidden. In the past, she was seen as a demonic creature who drained the life force of her victims, but her myth evolved as human society did. In modern depictions, she is often portrayed as a more complex figure, one who navigates the blurred lines between victim and villain, seductress and survivor. It's this complexity that keeps the succubus alive in the collective psyche. The succubus is timeless because she taps into universal fears and desires. At her core, she embodies the tension between the sacred and the profane, the known and the unknown, the light and the dark. She is temptation personified, the allure of a pleasure that carries consequences. She speaks to our deepest, most primal instincts, the need to experience something intense, something transcendent. Her seductive power isn't just sexual, it's psychological. She represents the allure of breaking free from the restrictions imposed by society and culture. To encounter a succubus is to feel something wild, untamed, and pure, even as it threatens to consume you. The myth speaks to the part of us that wants to feel alive in a world that often feels too controlled, too predictable. The succubus offers that escape, that rush, that fleeting moment of untouchable ecstasy. But there's more to the succubus myth than just the promise of pleasure. The enduring appeal of the succubus also lies in her power, the way she commands attention, the way she manipulates and controls her victims. Across cultures, she is often portrayed as a force of immense power, one who holds sway over the hearts and minds of those she encounters. In a world that frequently denies women autonomy and authority, the succubus becomes a symbol of power in its rawest form. She is the ultimate seductress, able to bend others to her will, to shape their desires and manipulate their fates. For centuries, societies have feared and revered the succubus because of this dangerous potential, the ability to seduce, dominate, and destroy. The succubus, however, is not always a figure of malice. In some mythologies, she is a more sympathetic character, a creature of darkness created by circumstance, bound by desires that she cannot control. In these stories, she reflects the human struggle with temptation and the consequences of acting on that temptation. The succubus is a tragic figure, doomed to live forever in the shadows, caught between her own desires and the reality of her existence. This tragic dimension adds another layer of complexity to her myth, making her not just a monster, but a reflection of the darker aspects of the human experience. Her enduring presence across cultures also points to the way myth adapts to the changing tides of society. In ancient cultures, she was feared as a demon, an entity who preyed upon the vulnerable. In medieval Christianity, she became a tool of the devil, used to tempt men into sin. But in the modern world, she is often portrayed in a much more nuanced light. She might still be a seductress, but she is also a figure of empowerment. In contemporary portrayals, succubi are often given more autonomy and complexity, showing that the myth is far from stagnant. The succubus myth has not been erased or forgotten. Instead, it has morphed into a figure that resonates with modern sensibilities. There is a certain thrill in the myth of the succubus that never fades. Even as society changes, as cultures evolve, as norms shift, there is something universally compelling about the succubus, the way she embodies both danger and allure, the way she challenges societal boundaries, and the way she taps into our deepest, darkest desires. She is both a seductress and a symbol of fear, a paradox that holds the power to captivate. The succubus is a myth that will never fade because it speaks to the human condition, our fears, our desires, and our fascination with the unknown. She is a timeless reflection of what it means to be human. The succubus, once a figure of dark myth and terror, now stands as a reflection of society's shifting views on sexuality, desire, and temptation. In ancient and medieval times, she was the embodiment of sinful, uncontrollable lust, an otherworldly creature that preyed upon the innocent, seducing men and draining their life force. The succubus wasn't just a creature of the night, she was a symbol of the dangers of forbidden pleasures and the consequences of yielding to temptation. Her legend was steeped in shame and fear, capturing the essence of the oppressive cultural norms that sought to repress human desire. But as the centuries passed, so too did the perception of the succubus, evolving along with the societies that gave birth to her. The strict religious doctrines and patriarchal systems that once demonized sexual autonomy began to break down, and with them, the image of the succubus transformed from a mere villain to a more complex and sometimes even empowering figure. Today, the succubus is no longer solely a demonic seductress, she is a mirror of the ever-changing landscape of desire itself. The sexual liberation movements of the 20th century marked a turning point in how we view female sexuality and autonomy. In an era where the expression of desire was long repressed, the emergence of more open and progressive views on sex allowed for the reinterpretation of many ancient myths, including that of the succubus. Once confined to the realm of horror and sin, the succubus began to take on a new role in pop culture and modern media. She became a symbol of sexual freedom, embracing her sensuality, her independence, and her power. No longer was she a demon to be feared and avoided, she was a figure of attraction, one that drew people in not through malevolent force, but through her irresistible allure. This shift is mirrored in the way society itself began to view sexuality. As taboo subjects became less censored and more discussed openly, the idea of sexual temptation underwent a transformation. Temptation no longer carried the same weight of damnation that it had in centuries past. Instead, it became a more complex and often even liberating concept. No longer was temptation something to be feared, it was something to be explored, to be indulged in, and sometimes even celebrated. The succubus, with her seduction and sensuality, embodied this newfound freedom. She was no longer simply the bearer of consequences, but a figure who both reflected and empowered the exploration of one's deepest sexual fantasies. In modern portrayals, the succubus is often shown as a figure of empowerment, a being who takes control of her own desires and uses them to manipulate and influence those around her. She no longer exists merely to drain and destroy, she exists to revel in the pleasures of the flesh and to express her autonomy over her own body. She represents sexual independence, a celebration of lust that challenges traditional gender roles and societal expectations. The succubus, in this light, becomes a feminist figure, one who defies the centuries-old notions of female passivity and submission, instead choosing to assert her own sexual power. However, as the succubus has evolved, so too has the interpretation of temptation itself. In an era where desire is no longer simply confined to a binary of good versus evil, temptation becomes a more complex and multifaceted experience. The succubus no longer represents just the consequences of yielding to temptation, she represents the very nature of temptation itself, unpredictable, thrilling, and often impossible to resist. The power she exerts is not only physical, but psychological, tapping into the unconscious desires and fantasies that reside within all of us. She symbolizes the push and pull of the forbidden, the danger of surrendering to one's own darkest urges, and the inevitable consequences of such indulgence. This shift in the portrayal of the succubus also reflects the growing complexity of modern views on sexuality. Today, we live in a world where pleasure is no longer seen as inherently sinful or wrong. The rise of discussions around consent, personal autonomy, and sexual freedom has given birth to a new understanding of desire. The succubus, now free from the strictures of religious condemnation, becomes a figure who can embody both the pleasures and the consequences of sexual exploration. She no longer represents a threat to moral order, but rather, she represents the liberation of the body and the mind. In a society where sexuality is often no longer stigmatized, the succubus becomes an agent of empowerment, showing that desire, though powerful and dangerous, is also a natural and essential part of human experience. Yet, as the succubus has evolved, so too has the way we view her as a reflection of our inner selves. While she was once a symbol of the external dangers of temptation, the modern succubus serves as a mirror of our internal struggles with desire. In a world where the boundaries between right and wrong are increasingly blurred, the succubus reflects our complex relationship with pleasure, guilt, and the pursuit of happiness. She is a symbol of both indulgence and consequence, offering us a glimpse into the darkest corners of our own psyche. In the end, the succubus is not just a figure of fantasy, she is a representation of the very human experience of grappling with our desires, our limitations, and the consequences of embracing both. As society continues to evolve and change, so too will the figure of the succubus. She will continue to shift and adapt, reflecting our ever-changing views on sexuality, power, and temptation. What was once a figure of fear has become a figure of empowerment, symbolizing the freedom to express one's desires without shame. And as the lines between morality and indulgence blur even further, the succubus will remain a powerful and provocative symbol, one that speaks to the timeless nature of human desire, and the seductive pull of the forbidden. For centuries, the succubus has been cast as the villain in myths and legends, painted as a seductress who lured men into their doom. She was the embodiment of temptation, a symbol of sin and moral decay. But in the hands of feminist thought, the succubus is being reclaimed, redefined, and reimagined as a symbol of empowerment. No longer merely a figure of fear and shame, the succubus is being transformed into a character that celebrates sexual autonomy, personal power, and the rejection of patriarchal constraints. In a world where women's sexuality has often been suppressed, demonized, or reduced to something shameful, the succubus represents a powerful act of defiance. She embodies sexual freedom and agency, unburdened by the guilt or judgment that society often places on women who dare to express their desires openly. The succubus, in this sense, becomes a challenge to the traditional roles that women are expected to play in society, roles of passivity, submission, and docility. By reclaiming her, feminist thought rejects the notion that women must be pure, innocent, or restrained in their sexual expression. In myth, the succubus was a creature that defied the norms of female behavior. She was independent, sexual, and powerful, a stark contrast to the demure, passive image of women that was commonly promoted in historical and religious teachings. The medieval church, with its rigid views on sexuality, portrayed the succubus as a demon of lust, warning men to avoid her tempting influence. She was a figure to be feared, to be avoided at all costs. But feminist theorists today have begun to ask, why should we fear a woman who takes control of her sexuality? Why should we demonize a figure who boldly claims her own desires without apology? The succubus is no longer merely a cautionary tale. In feminist thought, she becomes an agent of rebellion. She represents the refusal to conform to the expectations placed upon women by society. She is a character who exists outside of the narrow definitions of femininity that have been imposed upon women for centuries. The succubus is not afraid to embrace her sexual power, and in doing so, she challenges the traditional dynamics of gender and power. She becomes a feminist icon, showing that a woman's sexuality is her own to control, without shame, without guilt, and without fear of condemnation. The transformation of the succubus into a symbol of empowerment can also be seen as a response to the centuries of misogyny and sexism that have pervaded society. Historically, women's desires and sexual autonomy have been viewed as dangerous or immoral. The succubus, in her earlier depictions, was a reflection of these fears, a woman who used her sexuality to destroy men, to subvert the natural order. This portrayal echoed the widespread belief that women who embraced their sexuality were dangerous, corrupting forces that threatened to undermine the established social order. But today, as society grapples with the idea of sexual liberation and women's rights, the succubus is reclaiming her narrative. She is no longer a destructive force, she is a force of liberation, one who refuses to be bound by the societal constraints that have historically limited women's freedom. In many ways, the succubus represents the intersection of female empowerment and the desire for sexual autonomy. In reclaiming her, feminist thought asserts that women are entitled to express their desires just as freely as men, without being labeled as immoral or corrupt. The succubus becomes a symbol of sexual independence, of a woman who is unapologetic in her pursuit of pleasure and satisfaction. She is not a passive object of male desire, but an active participant in her own sexuality, choosing her own partners and making her own rules. The succubus, in this sense, embodies the feminist ideal of reclaiming agency over one's body and desires, rejecting the notion that women's sexual expression should be limited or controlled by external forces. This reclaiming of the succubus is also part of a broader cultural shift that is redefining the way we view female sexuality. In the past, women's desires were often seen as something to be feared or suppressed. Women who expressed sexual desire openly were often stigmatized, while men were celebrated for their sexual prowess. The succubus, once seen as a demon who seduced men into damnation, is now a figure who challenges these outdated and oppressive gender norms. She becomes a symbol of sexual equality, showing that women, too, have the right to explore their desires without shame or judgment. Feminists who embrace the succubus archetype often see her as a way to confront the ingrained cultural biases that still persist today. In a world where women's bodies are still frequently objectified, commodified, and controlled, the succubus represents a way for women to reclaim ownership of their bodies and their sexuality. She is no longer the victim of patriarchal oppression, she is the one who wields power, who takes control of her own destiny. In this way, the succubus becomes a tool for dismantling the systems that seek to oppress and silence women. The reclaiming of the succubus also has a profound impact on the way women's desires are viewed in society. Historically, women's sexual desires have been viewed with suspicion, if not outright hostility. The succubus, as a figure who freely embraces her sexuality, challenges this narrative. She asserts that women's desires are just as valid, just as powerful, and just as important as men's. In doing so, she helps to dismantle the shame that has long been associated with female sexual expression, allowing women to embrace their sexuality without fear or guilt. In feminist thought, the succubus represents a radical departure from the traditional images of women that have dominated cultural narratives for centuries. She is no longer a symbol of seduction and destruction, but a symbol of empowerment and freedom. She is the woman who refuses to be confined, the woman who takes control of her own desires and expresses them without fear or shame. In reclaiming the succubus, feminist thought challenges the oppressive structures that seek to define women's sexuality and reimagines the way we view sexual power. The succubus is no longer the villain in the story, she is the hero, reclaiming her agency and rewriting her narrative in her own image. In the quiet, shadowed corners of the human mind, where our deepest fears and desires reside, there exists a figure who transcends centuries of myth and folklore, the succubus. She is the embodiment of seduction, power, and fear. Her role in psychological exploration is no mere reflection of ancient superstitions, but a mirror to our modern understanding of the subconscious. In a world where sexuality, power, and control are subjects of intense scrutiny, the succubus archetype reveals far more than just a mythical creature. It speaks to the complexities of human nature, the darkness within, and the interplay between our conscious and unconscious selves. From the earliest records of folklore to the modern-day interpretations in film and literature, the succubus has remained a symbol of temptation, a harbinger of desires both fulfilled and unfulfilled. But it is her presence in modern psychology that offers a deeper, more nuanced exploration of what she truly represents. Within the realm of Jungian psychology, archetypes are considered universal symbols that exist within the collective unconscious, shared elements of the human experience that influence how we perceive ourselves and the world around us. The succubus, in this sense, is not simply a seductive demon but a reflection of the deepest parts of the psyche. The succubus represents a complex mixture of conflicting forces within the unconscious mind, primarily those relating to sexuality, power, and fear. As a seductress, she is associated with unbridled lust and desire, tapping into the primal instincts that lie dormant in the unconscious. Yet, she is also a creature of danger, an agent of destruction who often leaves her victims weakened or broken. This duality speaks to the inner conflict that many individuals experience when confronting their own desires. The succubus embodies the fear of surrendering to temptation, the anxiety that accompanies giving in to the darkest, most forbidden parts of ourselves. In modern psychology, the succubus archetype is often used to explore the human fear of sexual intimacy and vulnerability. For many, the idea of opening oneself to another, emotionally, physically, and mentally, can evoke a sense of dread. Sexuality, in particular, is a topic fraught with shame, guilt, and societal pressure. The succubus taps into these fears, representing the risks associated with unchecked desire and the potential for emotional or psychological harm. She becomes a symbol of the consequences of losing control, of surrendering too completely to another's will. In this way, the succubus embodies the struggle between embracing one's desires and maintaining self-protection and autonomy. But the succubus is not just a figure of fear. She also symbolizes power and agency, qualities that are often suppressed or misunderstood in modern psychological contexts. In traditional representations, the succubus is portrayed as the one who holds sway over her victims, those who are mesmerized by her beauty and allure. This inversion of power dynamics speaks to the complex relationship between control and submission, especially in sexual contexts. The succubus, in this sense, represents a reclaiming of power, an exploration of one's ability to dominate or be dominated. She reflects the untapped potential for empowerment that exists within the psyche, particularly for those who have been taught to fear or suppress their own desires. In modern psychology, the succubus archetype can also be used to examine the impact of societal conditioning on individuals' relationships with their sexuality. Historically, women have been taught to suppress their sexual agency, to remain passive, and to conform to societal expectations. In this context, the succubus represents a challenge to these norms, a rejection of the idea that women's sexuality should be controlled, limited, or punished. She embodies the idea of the empowered woman who takes ownership of her body and her desires, using her sexuality as a means of asserting control and autonomy. This modern interpretation of the succubus offers an alternative narrative to the traditional, passive female archetype, pushing against the boundaries that have historically confined women to predefined roles. However, it is important to recognize that the succubus also reveals the darker side of this empowerment. While she may embody sexual autonomy and agency, she also represents the consequences of unchecked power. The succubus archetype raises the question, what happens when power is misused, when one becomes consumed by the desire for control or domination? The succubus is a warning, a reminder that power must be balanced with responsibility and awareness. In this way, the succubus represents the potential dangers of overindulgence, whether in desire, power, or control. From a psychological perspective, the succubus serves as a reflection of the unconscious mind's struggle to integrate these conflicting forces. She is both a representation of desire and a warning against its excess. She reveals the complexity of human nature, showing how our desires, when left unchecked, can lead to harm or destruction. Yet, she also offers a glimpse into the potential for personal growth and empowerment that comes from embracing one's desires fully, without shame or guilt. The succubus is not a simple villain, but a multifaceted figure who represents both the shadows and the light of human experience. In contemporary psychological practice, the succubus archetype is often explored through dreams, fantasies, and unconscious projections. For those who experience vivid dreams of succubi or other seductive figures, these dreams can offer valuable insights into unresolved psychological conflicts. Dreams of succubi may symbolize repressed desires, feelings of guilt or shame surrounding sexuality, or the fear of vulnerability in intimate relationships. For others, the succubus may represent a desire for empowerment, control, or independence. By examining these dreams or projections, individuals can begin to understand the ways in which the succubus archetype is manifesting in their lives and explore how these unconscious elements influence their conscious thoughts and behaviors. Moreover, the succubus can be understood as a tool for self-reflection, encouraging individuals to confront their own internal conflicts surrounding desire, power, and fear. As a symbol of temptation, the succubus forces us to examine our own vulnerabilities and desires in a raw, unfiltered way. She invites us to question the limits we place on ourselves, the shame we carry, and the ways in which we have internalized societal norms around sexuality and power. In doing so, the succubus archetype encourages a process of self-discovery and healing, guiding individuals to integrate the darker aspects of their subconscious mind in order to achieve greater self-awareness and emotional balance. Ultimately, the succubus is not merely a creature of myth, but a reflection of the complexities of the human psyche. She represents the deepest, most primal parts of our nature, the parts we are often reluctant to acknowledge. In modern psychology, the succubus archetype offers valuable insights into our subconscious motivations, desires, and fears. She challenges us to confront the darkness within, to embrace our sexual and emotional complexities, and to find the balance between power and vulnerability, desire and restraint. The succubus is a figure of transformation, inviting us to confront our own inner demons and emerge stronger, wiser, and more self-aware. Throughout history, the succubus has been an enigmatic figure, weaving her way through various cultures and psychological landscapes, evolving and adapting in ways that reflect society's deepest fears, desires, and complexities. She is both a symbol of temptation and a reflection of power, a creature whose allure has sparked fascination and fear in equal measure. From the ancient Mesopotamian myths to modern psychological interpretations, the succubus remains a multifaceted symbol of the human condition, embodying the interplay between pleasure, danger, and the unknown. Culturally, the succubus has served as a mirror to the shifting attitudes toward sexuality, power, and gender. In many traditions, she is a seductive force, representing the forbidden, the taboo, and the consequences of indulgence. In others, she is a powerful figure who subverts the typical power dynamics, reclaiming agency in a world that often seeks to silence or control her. The succubus is as much about control as she is about surrender, revealing how societies have struggled to balance autonomy with the allure of temptation. Whether she is depicted as a demonic seductress or a more complex, empowered figure, the succubus reflects the way in which we have grappled with our understanding of desire, power, and morality. Psychologically, the succubus archetype delves into the subconscious mind, highlighting our innermost fears and desires. She embodies the contradictions within us all, the longing for intimacy and the fear of vulnerability, the temptation of unchecked desires and the consequences that may follow. The succubus is a reflection of the parts of ourselves we may not wish to acknowledge, the aspects of our psyche that are often suppressed or ignored. She challenges us to confront the darkness within, to understand the complex motivations that drive our actions and behaviors, and to come to terms with the dual nature of desire, both the beauty and the danger it entails. In the modern age, the succubus has transcended folklore and mythology to become a symbol of empowerment, liberation, and self-exploration. In contemporary culture, she has been reimagined as a figure of strength and autonomy, representing the ability to embrace one's desires fully and unapologetically. The rise of the succubus in modern media, from literature to film to online culture, speaks to the evolving views on sexuality and power, as well as the ongoing exploration of gender and agency. What was once a symbol of fear and shame has, for some, transformed into an emblem of empowerment and transformation. Yet, the succubus also serves as a reminder of the complexities of the human experience. She is not simply a figure of seduction but a reflection of the emotional, psychological, and spiritual battles that many face in navigating the intersection of power, sexuality, and self. The succubus is a reminder that desire is not only about pleasure but also about the consequences that come with giving in to temptation. She represents the shadows of our psyche, the parts we fear, and the parts we desire to control, even as we seek to embrace them. Ultimately, the myth of the succubus endures because it speaks to the timeless human experience. Across cultures, time periods, and belief systems, the succubus has embodied the complex relationship between humanity and its own desires, fears, and powers. She is a symbol of mystery, seduction, and transformation, both alluring and terrifying, beautiful and dangerous. The succubus forces us to confront our own vulnerabilities, our own desires, and the darker, often unspoken, parts of our nature. She is both a warning and an invitation, a figure that reminds us of the power within us to create, to destroy, and to transform.